Hello everyone, welcome to my new channel. I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In the summer of 2021, a white Ford Transit van became a symbol, an icon of a certain kind of modern dream. It represented freedom, adventure, and a life lived on one's own terms, documented for the world to see through the warm glow of a smartphone screen. The van, converted into a tiny home on wheels, was the vessel for a journey that was meant to be the adventure of a lifetime for a young, engaged couple from New York. Their story, played out across social media with curated smiles and stunning backdrops of the American West, captivated a growing audience. But behind the idyllic digital facade, a dark and volatile reality was unfolding, a reality that would end in tragedy in the vast wilderness of Wyoming and trigger a nationwide search that gripped the country. This is the story of that journey, the life it consumed, and the disturbing questions it left behind. The trip began on the 2nd of July, 2021. 22-year-old Gabrielle Petito, known to everyone as Gabby, and her 23-year-old fiancé, Brian Laundrie, pulled away from her hometown of Blue Point, New York. Their plan was ambitious and romantic, a 4-month, cross-country tour of the national parks that dot the western United States. The victim was the face of their adventure, a vibrant young woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a radiant smile. She was described by her family as a free spirit, an artist who was passionate about travel. She had an ambition to become a professional travel vlogger, and this trip was meant to be her grand debut. She and her fiancé had created a YouTube channel called Nomadic Static, and an Instagram presence to document their travels, sharing their experiences with a growing number of followers who were drawn to their seemingly perfect van life narrative. She was, by all accounts, energetic, friendly, and full of life, having worked at a restaurant to save up money for this very dream. Her fiancé was the quieter half of the pair. Also an artist who enjoyed sketching and reading, he projected an image of a man who loved nature and a minimalist lifestyle. He was thin, with brown hair and blue eyes, often bearded, and appeared more reserved in their videos. He and the victim had been high school classmates but only began dating in 2019, getting engaged in July of 2020. To the outside world, their social media painted a picture of a perfect match, two souls united by a shared love for exploration. But as the miles on the white van accumulated, it became clear that their relationship was far more complex and toxic than any filtered photo could ever reveal. Throughout July, the journey went according to plan, at least on the surface. The couple traveled through Kansas, Colorado, and Utah. Their posts showed them hiking through dramatic canyons, smiling under desert sunsets, and living the kind of life that many people dream of. The images were beautiful, but they were also a carefully constructed illusion, hiding a growing tension that was about to erupt into public view. The first visible crack in this perfect facade appeared on the 12th of August, in the small, bustling tourist town of Moab, Utah. Outside the Moonflower Community Cooperative, a natural food store, a witness saw a disturbing altercation between the couple. The witness became so concerned that they called 911. On the call, the witness reported seeing a man slapping a woman. The caller stated that the two had been arguing over a phone and that the man, the fiancé, had gotten into the van, with the woman trying to get in as well. The witness saw him hit her before they drove away. The 911 dispatch alerted officers to be on the lookout for the white van. Soon after, a Moab police officer spotted the vehicle speeding and swerving erratically. The officer initiated a traffic stop. The subsequent interaction, lasting over an hour, was captured in its entirety by the body cameras of the responding officers. This footage would later be scrutinized by millions around the world, offering a raw and heartbreaking glimpse into the couple's troubled dynamic. When the officer approached the van, the victim was in the passenger seat, visibly distraught. She was crying uncontrollably, struggling to speak between sobs. The fiancé, who was driving, appeared unnervingly calm and collected by comparison. The officers separated them to get their individual. The victim told the police that she had been suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder and that the stress of the trip, combined with her personal anxieties, had been causing friction between them. She admitted to hitting her fiancé first during an argument, explaining that he had locked her out of the van, and she was afraid he would drive off and leave her. The fiancé, meanwhile, told the officers a similar story but downplayed the physical aspect. He had small, visible scratches on his face, neck, and arm, which he claimed were from the victim flailing at him as he tried to calm her down. He told the police that he didn't want to press charges and that he just wanted to de-escalate the situation. The footage is difficult to watch. The victim appears to take much of the blame, apologizing. At one point she tells the officer, "I was trying to get him to stop telling me to calm down." It's a statement that many experts in domestic violence would later point to as a classic sign of a victim reacting to psychological abuse and control. Despite the 911 call reporting a male aggressor and the visible injuries on the fiancé, the officers on the scene made a fateful decision. They classified the incident not as a case of domestic violence, but as a mental health crisis. They concluded that the victim was the primary aggressor based on her admission and the fiancé's scratches. Under Utah law, this could have mandated an arrest. Instead, the officers chose a different path. They decided that the best course of action was to simply separate the couple for the night to let them cool off. They arranged for the fiancé to stay in a hotel, while the victim remained with the van. No charges were filed. No formal domestic violence report was taken. The officers, seemingly believing they had successfully mediated a lover's quarrel, sent them on their way the next. It was a critical juncture, a moment when intervention might have changed the outcome, but the opportunity was missed. Just 5 days after that police encounter, on August 17th, the fiancé did something that, in hindsight, seems incredibly strange. He flew from Salt Lake City, Utah, back to Tampa, Florida, leaving the victim and the van behind. He stayed in Florida with his parents for several days, reportedly to close out a storage unit and gather some items for their trip. He then flew back to Utah on August 23rd to rejoin his fiancée and continue their journey. The reason for this abrupt, solo trip in the middle of their grand adventure has never been fully explained. On August 19th, during that period when they were briefly apart, the couple posted their final video on their YouTube channel. It was an 8-minute montage titled, "Van Life Beginning Our Van Life Journey." The video is full of bright smiles, scenic vistas, and seemingly carefree moments. It shows them hiking, laughing, and kissing. It is the final piece of the public illusion they had so carefully crafted. For anyone watching, it looked like a dream come true. The days that followed marked the final, fading moments of the victim's life. On August 24th, she was seen checking out of a hotel in Salt Lake City. The next day, August 25th, she had her last known video call with her mother, Nicole Schmidt. She told her mother that they were leaving Utah and heading towards Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. This was the last time her mother would ever see her face or hear her voice. 2 days later, on August 27th, the victim's mother received a text message from her daughter's phone. It was an odd message. It read, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." Stan was the victim's grandfather, but her mother said her daughter rarely, if ever, referred to him by his first name. The message felt strange, out of character. The family now believes it was not sent by their daughter at all. It was the last communication of any kind received from her phone. After that text, there was only silence. The adventure had come to a dark and sudden end, somewhere in the rugged, remote wilderness of Wyoming. The final, strange text message on August 27th marked the beginning of an agonizing void for the victim's family. The daily calls and vibrant social media updates that had been a window into her journey abruptly ceased. As days of silence stretched into a week, a sense of unease blossomed into full-blown panic. Her parents, living on the other side of the country in New York and Florida, sent a barrage of texts and calls to both their daughter and her fiancé. Their daughter's phone was off. Her fiancé's phone rang, but he never answered. They reached out to his parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, hoping for an explanation, an update, anything. But their desperate pleas for information were met with a chilling, impenetrable wall of silence. They did not know it yet, but their daughter was already dead, her body left behind in the Wyoming wilderness, and the man they had trusted to protect her was driving her van and her secrets back home. According to the fiancé's own words, written months later in a notebook found with his remains, the victim died on or around August 27th. They were in the Spread Creek dispersed camping area of the Bridger Teton National Forest. His account, a self-serving and highly disputed narrative, framed the killing as a twisted act of mercy. He wrote that she had fallen into a creek during a hike and injured herself. He described her as being in extreme pain, crying, and shivering from the cold. He claimed he built a fire and tried to comfort her, but her condition worsened. It was in this state, he wrote, that he made the decision to end her life. "I ended her life," his note read. "I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock. This explanation, however, would later be directly contradicted by the forensic evidence. The act of killing someone by the method he chose was not a momentary, merciful impulse. It was a brutal and sustained act of violence. After taking her life, the fiancé's actions were not those of a man in shock or panic. They were the actions of a fugitive. He left her body where it lay and got back into the white van. For the next 2 days, he drove east, a solitary journey of over 2,000 miles, alone with the knowledge of what he had done. On September 1st, he arrived back at his parents' house in Northport, Florida. He was alone. The van that had symbolized a shared dream was now evidence of a solo return. He said nothing to his fiancée's family. He did not report her missing. He did not report an accident. He simply returned home and resumed a life, as if the woman he was supposed to marry had never existed. In a move that would later shock and appall the public, just 5 days after his return, the fiancé and his parents went on a camping trip together at the Fort DeSoto Park, a local campground. While the victim's family was desperately trying to find their daughter, her killer was vacationing with his own. On September 11th, after nearly 2 weeks of unanswered calls and texts, the victim's family could wait no longer. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, officially filed a missing person report with the Suffolk County Police in New York. The investigation began immediately, and law enforcement in Northport, Florida, were notified. That evening, officers arrived at the home of the Laundrie family. They were hoping to speak with the fiancé, the last person to have seen the victim alive, but they were met with a stunning lack of cooperation. The family refused to speak. They handed the officers a piece of paper with their lawyer's contact information and closed the door. The fiancé's silence was deafening, and in the absence of any explanation, it was interpreted by the public and police as an admission of guilt. He was officially named a person of interest in his fiancée's disappearance. The white Ford Transit van was seized by the FBI from the Laundrie's driveway and taken in for forensic processing. While the family remained silent, the story exploded into a national obsession. The victim's youth, her aspirations as a vlogger, and the trove of photos and videos from her seemingly perfect trip created a compelling, and ultimately tragic, narrative. Social media, the very tool she had used to build her dream, was now instrumental in the search for her. A global community of internet sleuths began to dissect every frame of their videos, every caption of their photos, looking for clues. Then, as the investigation intensified, the case took another bizarre turn. On September 17th, the fiancé's parents contacted the Northport police. They wanted to report their own son missing. They claimed they had last seen him on the evening of September 13th, 4 days earlier. According to them, their son had packed a backpack and told them he was going for a hike in the nearby Carlton Reserve, a massive 25,000-acre wilderness area. The reserve is a notoriously difficult and dangerous terrain, a network of swamps, thick forests, and hiking trails, populated by alligators, snakes, and other wildlife. The parents' delay in reporting his disappearance, especially given his status as a person of interest in a high-profile case, raised immediate suspicion and further fueled public anger. The man at the center of the mystery had vanished, sparking a massive manhunt in the treacherous Florida swampland. While law enforcement waded through the murky waters of the Carlton Reserve, a critical breakthrough came from the very community that had been following the case so closely. A couple of travel vloggers, Jen and Kyle Bethune, who run a YouTube channel called Red, White, and Bethune, were editing footage from their own cross-country trip. They had been in the Grand Teton area at the end of August. On the evening of August 27th, they had driven through the Spread Creek dispersed camping area looking for a spa. Their vehicle's dashcam had been running. As they reviewed the footage, they saw a small, white van parked on the side of a dirt road. It was a Ford Transit with Florida plates. It was Gabby Petito's van. They realized they had captured a crucial piece of evidence, pinpointing the van's location on the very day of the last communication. They immediately sent their findings to the FBI. This tip was the key investigators had been looking for. It narrowed the vast search area of the Grand Teton National Park down to a single, manageable location. The FBI and local law enforcement descended on the Spread Creek campsite. For 2 days, a team of searchers scoured the remote area. Then, on the afternoon of Sunday, September 19th, they found what they had been dreading. Near the location where the van had been spotted, they discovered human remains. The description matched that of the missing 22-year-old vlogger from New York. A 9-day, nationwide search was over. The worst fears of her family, and of a nation that had been following her story, had been realized. a supervisory agent for the FBI made a somber public statement confirming the discovery and offering condolences to the family. The question was no longer where she was. The questions now were how she died and where the man who drove home without her had gone. The discovery of the victim's body on September 19th in the Bridger-Teton National Forest was a devastating confirmation of what her family and the public had come to fear. The focus of the investigation shifted instantaneously and with immense intensity. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide investigation, and there was only one person of interest, the victim's fiancé, who was now a fugitive, hiding somewhere in the vast, swampy wilderness of Florida. 2 days after the discovery, on September 21st, the Teton County coroner, Dr. Brent Blue, held a press conference. After a thorough autopsy, he officially confirmed that the remains were those of Gabrielle Petito. He then delivered the grim findings that extinguished any lingering hope for a different explanation. The cause of her death was ruled to be strangulation, and the manner of death was homicide. In a later interview, the coroner would specify the cause as manual strangulation, meaning she had been killed by hand. This finding was crucial. Strangulation is an incredibly personal and violent act. It is not quick or accidental. It requires a perpetrator to use their own hands, to feel the life draining from their victim, and to maintain pressure for a sustained period of time. This brutal reality stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the gentle, smiling images the victim had posted throughout her journey. The coroner also estimated that she had been deceased for approximately 3 to 4 weeks before her body was found, placing her death squarely in the time frame of her last communication at the end of August. With the cause of death confirmed as homicide, the pressure to find the fiancé escalated dramatically. While he was the prime suspect, investigators still lacked the direct evidence needed for a murder warrant. So, the FBI executed a clever legal strategy to officially declare him a federal fugitive. On September 23rd, the U.S. District Court of Wyoming issued a federal arrest warrant for Brian Laundrie. The charge was not for murder, for the illicit use of a financial The indictment alleged that between August 30th and September 1st, the fiancé had used a debit card and PN number for accounts belonging to the victim to make unauthorized withdrawals or purchases worth more than $1,000. This was the period immediately following her death, when he was driving alone across the country. The warrant was critical. It transformed him from a person of interest into a wanted man, allowing law enforcement agencies nationwide to arrest him on sight. Meanwhile, the manhunt in Florida had become a grueling and frustrating ordeal. The Carlton Reserve, where his parents claimed he had gone hiking, was an unforgiving environment for a search. The 25,000-acre expanse was, in many areas, waist-deep in water due to recent heavy rainfall. Search teams from the FBI, the Northport Police Department, and several other local agencies deployed every tool at their disposal. They used K-9 units, drones, helicopters, and all-terrain vehicles, including specialized swamp buggies. For weeks, they navigated the treacherous landscape, battling the dense vegetation, scorching heat, and the constant threat of venomous snakes and alligators. The search was slow, dangerous, and yielded no results. Day after day, news crews broadcast images of search teams wading through murky water, a stark visual representation of an investigation that seemed to be going nowhere. For over a month, the search for the fugitive continued, with the public's attention fixed on the Florida swampland. Then, on October 20th, there was a sudden and decisive break in the case. The fiancé's parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, who had until this point remained publicly silent, informed the FBI that they wanted to join the search themselves. They met law enforcement that morning at the Myaketchee Creek Environmental Park, an area that adjoins the larger Carlton Reserve and includes a trail their son was known to frequent. The parents and the officers walked down a path that their son often used. In a section of the park that had, until recently, been underwater, they made a discovery. First, an agent found a dry bag belonging to the fiancé. The parents identified it as his. The bag contained some of his personal effects, including a notebook. Soon after, a backpack was also located. The discovery of these items in a location that had been previously searched, but was now dry, prompted a more intensive search of the immediate area. Law enforcement brought in a cadaver dog. The dog quickly alerted them to a spot nearby. There, scattered among the palmettos and swampy undergrowth, they found partial human remains. The month-long manhunt was over. The discovery on the day the parents chose to join the search sparked a wave of speculation and conspiracy theories. with many questioning the timing as being too coincidental. However, law enforcement officials maintained that the receding water levels were the simple explanation for why the items were suddenly visible. The following day, October 21st, dental records were used to confirm the inevitable. The remains belonged to Brian Laundrie. After weeks of searching and national speculation, the man at the center of the mystery had been found. But his death created a new void in the case. The one person who knew exactly what happened in Wyoming and why was gone, seemingly taking his secret. On November 23rd, after a full autopsy, the District 12 Medical Examiner's Office released their findings. They confirmed that the fiancé had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. His manner of death was ruled a suicide. The discovery of his cause of death answered the question of how his life ended, but the most important questions of the entire case remain. Why did he kill his fiancée? What were the exact events that led to that final, violent act? It seemed as though true justice for the victim, a full accounting of her final moments, had died with him in the Florida swamp. But there was one last piece of evidence, one final testament left behind. A notebook, recovered from the dry bag, damaged by water but still potentially legible, was sent to the FBI crime lab for analysis. It was the last hope for answers, a final voice from beyond the grave. With the perpetrator's death confirmed as a suicide, the active criminal investigation into the murder of Gabrielle Petito drew to a close. The manhunt was over, and the sole suspect was beyond the reach of the law. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no day in court. For a time, it seemed the full truth of what transpired in the Wyoming wilderness had been buried with him. But one final piece of his story remained: the water-damaged notebook found beside his body. After weeks of painstaking forensic analysis, the FBI managed to recover the writing within its pages. On January 21, 2022, the Bureau released its final investigative update, officially closing the case. In that announcement, they revealed that the notebook contained a written confession. In his final words, the fiancé took full responsibility for his fiancée's death. His account was a chilling, self-pitying narrative that attempted to reframe a brutal homicide as an act of compassion. He wrote that the killing occurred after she had sustained an injury from a fall in a creek. He claimed she was in immense pain, freezing, and disoriented. His confession stated, "I ended her life. I thought it was merciful, that it is what she wanted, but I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock." He went on to describe himself as being in a frantic state, attempting to portray his actions as a desperate response to a tragic accident. But this narrative was completely undermined by the physical evidence. The Teton County coroner had been unequivocal. The cause of death was manual strangulation. It was an act of intimate, hands-on violence, not a panicked response. His confession was seen by the victim's family and legal experts not as a genuine account, but as the final, cowardly act of a manipulator trying to control the story, even after his death. With this confession, however, the FBI had what it needed. They officially concluded that Brian Laundrie was the sole person responsible for the murder of Gabby Petito. While the criminal case was closed, the quest for a different kind of justice was just beginning. The victim's parents, Joseph Petito and Nicole Schmidt, firmly believed that the fiancé's parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, bore a moral and legal responsibility for the suffering they endured. In March of 2022, they filed a civil lawsuit against the Laundries in Florida. The lawsuit did not accuse them of involvement in the murder itself. Instead, it charged them with intentional infliction of emotional distress. The suit alleged that the Laundrie parents knew their son had murdered his fiancée. They knew she was dead and likely knew where her body was located, yet they chose to remain silent. The lawsuit laid out a timeline of profound cruelty. While the victim's family was frantically trying to get information, the Laundries blocked their calls and texts. Even more egregiously, on September 14, 2021, while the search for their daughter was a matter of intense national focus, the Laundries' lawyer released a statement on their behalf, saying, "It is our hope that the search for Miss Petito is successful and that Miss Petito is reunited with her family." The lawsuit argued that this statement was monstrously cynical, as they knew she was already dead. The suit claimed their actions were outrageous and had caused the Petito family unimaginable pain and suffering. During the legal proceedings of this civil case, a shocking piece of evidence came to light. The FBI revealed the existence of a letter, written by the perpetrator's mother to her son, which she had marked "burn after reading" on the envelope. The contents of the letter were deeply disturbing. In it, the mother offered to help her son dispose of a body and spoke of baking a cake with a file in it if he were to end up in prison. The laundry's legal team argued the letter was written long before the trip and was simply a reflection of a mother's dark humor and inside jokes with her son. But for the Petito family, the letter was damning proof of a disturbing family dynamic and a potential willingness to cover up a heinous crime. In November of 2022, the lawsuit reached a conclusion. The Petito family was awarded a $3 million settlement. While the money could never compensate for their loss, the verdict was a legal acknowledgement of the harm the laundry's silence had caused. The Petito family's fight for accountability did not end there. They also turned their attention to the moment they believe was the last clear chance to save their daughter's life. The police stop in Moab, Utah. They filed a $50 million wrongful death lawsuit against the Moab City Police Department. The lawsuit argues that the officers who stopped the couple on August 12 failed to properly investigate the incident as a case of domestic violence. They allege the officers were not adequately trained to recognize the subtle signs of abuse, such as the victim's extreme distress versus the fiancé's calculated calm. They contend that had the officers followed Utah law and arrested the perpetrator, their daughter would have been separated from her killer and might still be alive today. That lawsuit is still making its way through the legal system, but it has already succeeded in forcing a national conversation about the need for better police training in handling domestic violence calls. The tragic death of Gabby Petito left an indelible mark on her family and on the nation. In the depths of their grief, her parents chose to build a legacy of hope. They established the Gabby Petito Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting other families with missing loved ones and shedding light on the silent epidemic of domestic violence. The case also highlighted a phenomenon often called missing white woman syndrome, prompting important discussions about why cases involving young, attractive white women often receive disproportionate media coverage compared to those of missing persons from minority communities. The intense spotlight on this case also created what has been called the Gabby Petito effect. The massive public engagement and social media attention led to tips and awareness that, in a positive ripple effect, helped locate several other missing persons in unrelated cases during the same time period. Ultimately, the story that began with a white van and a dream of adventure became a heartbreaking cautionary tale. Many questions remain unanswered. What was the specific trigger for the final, fatal argument? How much did the fiancé's parents know, and when did they know it? What was the true purpose of his solo flight home in mid-August? These are details that are likely lost forever. The case of Gabby Petito is a stark reminder that the images we see on social media are often a carefully curated fiction. Behind the perfect smiles and breathtaking landscapes can lie a reality of control, abuse, and fear. Her story, broadcast to the world, has forced a vital conversation about the nature of domestic violence, serving as a tragic but powerful lesson that the most dangerous journey is sometimes the one you take with the person you are supposed to trust. Case 2. In late January of 2013, a 21-year-old student from the University of British Columbia was on an adventure. Her name was Alyssa Lam, the daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong who had settled in Burnaby, a suburb of Vancouver, Canada. She had embarked on a solo trip down the west coast of the United States, a journey she called her West Coast Tour. For her, this was more than just a vacation. It was a pilgrimage of self-discovery. She documented her thoughts, fears, and observations on a public blog she maintained on Tumblr, titled Ether Fields. Her posts were a collage of fashion photos, artistic quotes, and deeply personal reflections. They painted a picture of a complex young woman, intelligent, introspective, and articulate, but also one who grappled with feelings of loneliness and the heavy weight of her own mind. This internal struggle was not just philosophical. The victim had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, a serious mental health condition characterized by extreme shifts in mood, from manic highs to depressive lows. She also battled depression. To manage her condition, she had been prescribed a cocktail of 4 medications: an antidepressant, a mood stabilizer, and an antipsychotic. Her journey was, in part, an act of defiance against her illness, an attempt to prove to herself that she could navigate the world independently. She was determined to live, to explore, and to connect with the world beyond her internal struggles. On January 26th, she arrived in Los Angeles via an Amtrak train, another stop on her planned tour. 2 days later, on January 28th, she checked into her accommodation, the Cecil Hotel at 640 South Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. On the surface, it was a budget hotel, a place for travelers looking for an affordable stay in the heart of the city. But the Cecil was no ordinary hotel. Its history was steeped in darkness, a silent witness to decades of human misery. Built in 1924, the grand, 14-story Beaux Arts building was once a jewel of the city. However, its fortunes declined with the surrounding neighborhood. The hotel sat ominously close to Skid Row, an area that had become synonymous with poverty, homelessness, and high rates of crime. Over the years, the Cecil's reputation had become intertwined with death. It was the site of numerous suicides, with guests leaping from its windows. It was a place where murders were committed and secrets were buried. Most notoriously, it had been a temporary residence for at least two infamous serial killers. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, reportedly lived on the 14th floor during his terrifying murder spree in the mid-1980s. A decade later, the Austrian journalist and serial killer Jack Unterweger also called the Cecil home while he stalked and murdered local sex workers. The hotel's very walls seemed to absorb the tragedies that unfolded within them, earning it a reputation as one of the most haunted and cursed locations in America. By the time the Canadian student arrived, the hotel was attempting a rebrand. A portion of the building had been partitioned off and marketed as Stay on Main, a hipper, more modern hostel aimed at a younger international crowd, complete with shared dormitory-style rooms. The rest of the building remained the old Hotel Cecil. The victim was initially placed in one of these shared rooms, a dorm on the 5th floor, with several other travelers. For the first 2 days, her stay seemed uneventful. But on January 30th, the hotel management received complaints from her roommates. They described what they called odd behavior. The young student was reportedly leaving strange, cryptic notes on their beds, with messages like "go away" and "go home." Her actions were unsettling enough that the management decided it was best to move her. On the morning of January 31st, she was relocated from the shared dorm to a private room of her own on 4th floor, room 412. This was the last day anyone would verifiably see her alive and well. That afternoon, she visited the Last Bookstore, a sprawling and iconic bookshop located a short distance from the hotel. The owner of the bookstore, a woman named Katie Orphan, later recalled their interaction. She described the student as bubbly and friendly, full of energy. She was buying books and music to take back home as gifts for her family in Canada. The bookstore owner saw nothing to indicate distress or alarm. She simply saw a happy young tourist enjoying her day in a new city. This cheerful, ordinary image would become the final public memory of her, a stark and haunting contrast to what was about to unfold. She returned to the hotel that evening. What happened within its walls during the night of January 31st and the earlies of February 1st remains the central, agonizing mystery of the case. Her plan was straightforward. She was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel on February 1st and continue her journey north to Santa Cruz. But she never checked out. Back in British Columbia, her parents, David and Yina Lam, began to worry. Their daughter was diligent about checking in with them every single day of her trip. It was a rule, a promise. When February 1st came and went with no phone call, their concern quickly escalated into panic. They knew immediately that something was. They tried calling her, but there was no answer. They contacted the hotel, but she wasn't in her room. With a growing sense of dread, they did the only thing they could. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their 21-year-old daughter missing. The search for Alyssa Lam had officially begun. The Los Angeles Police Department initially treated the case as a standard missing person investigation. A 21-year-old tourist had vanished, and while concerning, it was not initially considered suspicious. The first and most logical place to search was the hotel itself. Detectives were dispatched to the Cecil, a sprawling building with hundreds of rooms and a labyrinth of corridors. They entered room 412, the private room the victim had been moved to. Inside, they found a scene frozen in time. All of her belongings were there, seemingly untouched. Her clothing, her laptop, her wallet, and her identification papers. Everything an international traveler would need was accounted for, with one critical exception. Her cell phone was missing. It was never found. The fact that she had left everything else behind suggested she had not planned to leave for long, or that she had left in a hurry, or under duress. The police expanded their search. They combed through the hotel's public areas, reviewed what security footage was available, and conducted interviews with hotel staff and the few guests who remembered seeing her. They brought in a canine unit, and the police dogs did pick up a scent. The trail led them from her room down the hall to a particular window. This window opened onto an external fire escape, a potential route out of the building's main corridors. The dogs also tracked her scent up to the hotel's top floor, leading them to the area near the locked door that provided access to the roof. But at both locations, the trail went cold. The scent vanished, leaving investigators with a frustrating dead end. It was a clue that pointed towards the roof, but provided no definitive answers. For nearly 2 weeks, the investigation yielded nothing. Flyers with her picture were distributed around the neighborhood, but no credible sightings were reported. Detectives found no evidence of foul play in her room, no signs of a struggle. Her credit cards and bank accounts remained inactive. Her online presence, once a daily chronicle of her life, had fallen silent. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist after the night of January 31st. With all conventional leads exhausted, the LAPD made a decision they hoped would break the case wide open. On February 13, 2013, they released a piece of evidence to the public, a grainy, unsettling piece of surveillance footage captured inside one of the Cecil Hotel's elevators. It was the last known recording of Alyssa Lamb. The video is just under 4 minutes long, and it is profoundly disturbing. It begins with the victim, dressed in a red zippered hoodie over a gray t-shirt, entering the elevator alone. The camera is mounted in the top rear corner of the elevator car, providing a clear, wide view. She steps in and leans forward, pressing a series of buttons on the control panel. Then, she retreats to the back corner and waits. But the elevator doors do not close. After a few seconds, she cautiously approaches the doorway. She leans forward, her head poking out, and looks to her left, then quickly to her right, as if checking the hallway for someone. Seeing nothing, or perhaps seeing something alarming, she darts back inside the elevator, pressing herself into the corner farthest from the door, as if trying to hide. The doors still remain open. She approaches the entrance again, this time stepping just outside the elevator into the hallway, on the left. She looks right, then left again, and then, her behavior becomes even more bizarre. She stands just outside the elevator, her body language tense. She begins to make a series of strange, deliberate gestures with her hands. Her arms are stiff, her fingers splayed and then clenched, as if she were counting, or casting a spell, or trying to communicate with someone just out of the camera's view. She brings her hands to the sides of her head at one point, then lets them fall. For nearly 30 seconds, she continues this strange pantomime in the hallway. Finally, she turns and walks away to the left, disappearing from the frame completely. Only then, after she is gone, do the elevator doors mysteriously slide shut. They open again a moment later, then close one final time. The elevator car then begins to ascend, stopping on several floors, its doors opening and closing to an empty hallway each time. The release of the video had an explosive and immediate effect. It did not generate the helpful lead the police were looking for. Instead, it transformed the missing person case into a global internet phenomenon. The footage went viral, viewed millions of times on YouTube and Chinese video sites like Youku. An army of online sleuths emerged, dedicating countless to dissecting every second of the recording. Theories proliferated, ranging from the plausible to the paranormal. Some were convinced she was under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs, her movements a product of a chemical-induced paranoia. Others believed she was hiding from a real pursuer, someone who was either in the hallway or had followed her into the elevator and was hiding in the camera's blind spot. Her strange hand gestures were interpreted as a sign of a psychotic episode, a complete break from reality. And given the hotel's sinister history, many were certain she was interacting with a supernatural entity, a ghost from the Cecil's dark past. The speculation was fueled by apparent anomalies in the video itself. Viewers noted that the timestamp at the bottom of the screen was obscured, making it impossible to know the exact time of the events. Some analysts claimed the video appeared to have been slowed down, perhaps to make her movements seem more deliberate. Most significantly, there seemed to be a missing portion of the footage, nearly a full minute that was unaccounted for. This led to widespread belief that the video had been intentionally edited by the hotel or the police to conceal the involvement of another person. The elevator video became the central obsession of the case, a haunting final puzzle box left behind by the victim. But while the world was transfixed by the digital ghost in the elevator, a much grimmer, more tangible problem was developing back at the Cecil Hotel. Around the same time the video was released, guests began to complain. At first, it was about the water pressure, which was unusually weak. Then, the complaints became more specific and more disgusting. The water that flowed from the taps had a strange, foul taste. Some described it as sweetish, but deeply unpleasant. A British couple staying at the hotel would later tell reporters that when they turned on the shower, the water would come out black for the first few seconds before running clear. They, and others, drank it, brushed their teeth with it, and bathed in it. For days, the source of the problem remained a mystery. By the morning of February 19th, nearly 3 weeks after the student's disappearance, the complaints about the water had reached a tipping point. The hotel's management could no longer ignore the issue. The general manager instructed a maintenance employee, a man named Santiago Lopez, to go to the one place that could explain a hotel-wide problem. He was to go to the roof and physically inspect the hotel's water supply. His destination was a platform where 4 large, cylindrical metal water tanks stood, each 10 feet tall, holding the water for all the rooms below. As the maintenance worker made his way to the roof to find the source of the foul water, he had no idea he was also about to solve the mystery of the missing guest. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a place most guests never saw. It was a flat, industrial space, home to ventilation systems, ductwork, and the 4 imposing, cylindrical water cisterns that stood side by side on a raised concrete platform. Each tank was approximately 10 feet tall and 4.5 feet in diameter, constructed of metal and painted a dull, functional gray. Access to the top of each tank was provided by a simple metal ladder fixed to its side. When the maintenance worker, Santiago Lopez, arrived on the roof that morning of February 19th, his task was simple: investigate the tanks to find the source of the water problem. As he approached the cisterns, he immediately noticed something was out of place. The circular metal hatch on top of one of the 4 tanks was open. It was not sealed shut as it should have been. This was the first sign of trouble. He selected a ladder and began to climb, ascending the side of the massive tank. When he reached the top, he peered down into the dark opening. The water inside was still and black. At first, he saw nothing, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, a shape began to resolve itself. Just inches below the surface of the water, something pale was floating. He stared for a moment, his mind struggling to process the image. It was the body of a person, lying face up in the water. Horrified, the maintenance worker scrambled back down the ladder, his heart pounding. He immediately radioed his supervisor, who in turn called 911. The response was swift. Police, firefighters, and paramedics converged on the Cecil Hotel. The roof, which had been a point of interest early in the search, now became an active crime scene. The body was quickly identified as that of the missing Canadian student. After 19 days of searching, she had been found, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. The immediate question was how to recover the body. The opening at the top of the tank was too small for personnel to safely enter and lift her out without disturbing the scene or potentially damaging the body, which was now evidence in a death investigation. The Los Angeles Fire Department devised a grim and difficult plan. First, they had to drain the entire tank, which held thousands of gallons of water. Once the water level was low enough, they used powerful cutting tools to carve a large, square hole in the side of the metal cistern. It was only through this opening that they were finally able to retrieve her. The victim was found completely naked. Submerged at the bottom of the tank, covered in a layer of what appeared to be sand or sediment, were her clothes. The same red hoodie and gray t-shirt she had been wearing in the elevator video. Her room key and watch were also found with her clothing. 2 days later, on February 21st, the Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner coroner performed the autopsy. The world, which had been speculating about a violent murder or a sinister conspiracy, waited for a revelation. But the results were baffling. The coroner found no evidence whatsoever of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no cuts, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle of any kind. A sexual assault examination was also performed, and the results were negative. There was no evidence to suggest she had been attacked or forcibly submerged. The examination also found no signs that would point to suicide, such as hesitation marks or self-inflicted wounds. Physically, her body offered no clues that another person had been involved in her death. The key to the case would lie in the toxicology report, which took several more months to complete. When the results were finalized, they debunked the most prevalent online theory. There were no illegal drugs in her system. No cocaine, no heroin, no amphetamines, and no common hallucinogens like LSD or PCP. There was also no alcohol. The tests did, however, detect the presence of her prescribed medications Wellbutrin and Lamotrigine, as well as a common over-the-counter medication, Sinutab. But the report contained a crucial detail. The levels of her prescription drugs were extremely low. It appeared that she had either stopped taking her medication entirely in the days leading up to her death, or was taking doses far below what she had been prescribed. For a person with bipolar I disorder, abruptly ceasing medication can have catastrophic consequences, often triggering severe manic or psychotic episodes. With all the evidence compiled, the coroner's office released its final, official conclusion in June of 2013. The cause of death was ruled as an accidental drowning, and listed as a significant contributing factor were two words: bipolar disorder. In the eyes of the law, the case was closed. The perpetrator was not a person, but the victim's own illness. Investigators pieced together a timeline of her finals based on this conclusion. They believed that, due to her failure to properly take her medication, she had suffered a severe psychotic episode. This condition, a complete break from reality, would explain her bizarre and paranoid behavior in the elevator. In her mind, the delusions would have felt terrifyingly real. She likely believed she was being pursued by a dangerous, unseen threat. In this state of profound fear and paranoia, she would have desperately sought a place to hide. Investigators theorized she made her way to the roof, likely via the fire escape that the K9 unit had scented. Once on the roof, away from the hotel's confusing corridors, the massive water tanks would have presented themselves as the ultimate hiding place. She would have had to climb the ladder, and despite the lid being described as heavy, investigators concluded it was possible for her to have opened it herself. She then would have climbed inside, perhaps believing it was the only way to escape her imaginary pursuer. Once inside the tank, there was no way out. The water was cold, and the interior walls of the tank were slick and offered no handholds. The water level was likely low enough that she could not reach the top opening to pull herself out. Trapped in the dark, cold water, she would have quickly succumbed to exhaustion and hypothermia. As for why she was found naked, the coroner pointed to a known phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. It is a behavior documented in victims of severe hypothermia. In the final stages, as their mind becomes confused and their nerve endings are damaged, they experience a sensation of being intensely, burningly hot, causing them to remove their clothing. Investigators believe this is what happened in her final moments. It was a tragic, lonely, and horrific end. The mystery that had captivated millions was, according to the official report, not a murder or a haunting. It was a healthcare tragedy, the final, fatal result of a young woman's devastating battle with a severe mental illness, which found her in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and in the wrong state of mind. For the LAPD, the case of Alyssa Lam was solved. Although the Los Angeles coroner's office and the LAPD had officially closed their files on the case, the story was far from over for the victim's family. In September of 2013, her parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Cecil Hotel. Their legal argument was straightforward. The hotel was negligent and had failed in its duty to ensure the safety of its guests. They contended that the hotel should have taken reasonable measures to prevent guests from accessing potentially dangerous areas, such as the rooftop water tanks. Their lawsuit argued that the hotel either knew or should have known that the rooftop was a potential hazard, and that it was foreseeable a guest might find their way up there. The hotel's legal team countered with a firm defense. They argued that the chain of events leading to the student's death was so bizarre and specific that it was utterly unforeseeable. They claimed they had no duty of care to prevent a guest from, as their lawyers put it, climbing into one of their rooftop water tanks. They maintained that the hotel had taken reasonable precautions, such as a locked door and an alarm system, to limit roof access. To hold the hotel responsible, they argued, would be to expect them to anticipate and guard against every conceivable, however improbable, action a guest might take. In December of 2015, a judge for the Los Angeles Superior Court agreed with the hotel. The judge dismissed the lawsuit, ruling that the victim's death was unforeseeable from the hotel's perspective, and therefore, the hotel could not be held liable for the tragedy. For the family, the legal road to accountability had come to an end. For the public, however, the official verdict of accidental death was far from satisfying. It felt incomplete, a simple explanation for a set of deeply complex and disturbing facts. A number of nagging questions remain unanswered, fueling a cottage industry of conspiracy theories that continues to this day. Chief among them was the question of access. How, exactly, did she get onto the roof? The hotel staff insisted the main access door was locked and equipped with an alarm that would have sounded at the front desk and on the top 2 floors if open. No staff member reported hearing such an alarm that night. This left the fire escape as the most likely alternative, a route that would have required a difficult and dangerous climb. The official investigation never definitively established her path, leaving a critical gap in the narrative. Then there was the matter of the water tank lid. The maintenance worker who found the body stated that the hatch was open, but police reports described the lid as heavy and difficult to move. This created a major point of contention. Could a small woman, weighing just 115 pounds, have lifted the heavy lid by herself, climbed in, and then somehow closed it behind her? The idea seemed improbable to many. This single, conflicting detail about the lid, whether it was open or closed, heavy or manageable, became a cornerstone for theories involving a third party. Furthermore, critics of the official investigation pointed to the initial police search. The LAPD, with K9 units, had searched the roof in the early days of the investigation. Why had they found nothing? Did they fail to look inside the 4 massive water tanks? Or was it possible that she was not in the tank at the time of that first search? This latter possibility opened up a terrifying timeline where she may have been alive, and possibly held captive, somewhere else in the hotel for days after her disappearance. And finally, there was the elevator video. The claims of tampering the obscured timestamp, the seemingly altered speed, the missing minute of footage were never officially debunked to the public's satisfaction. To believers in a cover-up, the video was not evidence of a psychotic break, but evidence of a crime that had been deliberately concealed. The case was made even more compelling by a series of bizarre and shocking coincidences. Internet sleuths discovered an eerie parallel in the 2005 American horror film Dark Water. The plot of the movie involves a mother and daughter who move into a run-down apartment building and are plagued by discolored, foul-tasting water. The film's climax reveals the source of the contamination: the body of a young girl who had drowned in the building's rooftop water tank. The similarities to the real-life case were so striking that many saw it as more than a coincidence. Another strange detail emerged shortly after the body was found. A severe and drug-resistant outbreak of tuberculosis occurred on Skid Row, very near the hotel. The name of the diagnostic test used for this specific type of tuberculosis was the Leishman test, an acronym that perfectly matched the victim's name. This was, of course, a complete and verifiable coincidence, but in the superheated atmosphere of online speculation, it became yet another piece of evidence for a wider conspiracy. But perhaps the most visceral and disturbing detail of all was the experience of the hotel guests. For up to 19 days, the residents and tourists staying at the Cecil Hotel had been using water from the tank where the victim's body was actively decomposing. A British couple interviewed after the discovery described the water in their room having a funny, sweet, disgusting taste. They said, "It was a very strange taste. We never thought anything of it." They, along with hundreds of other guests, had been drinking, showering, and brushing their teeth with contaminated water, a horrifying fact that became a public relations nightmare for the hotel and a source of global revulsion. The legacy of the case is multifaceted. For the Cecil Hotel, it was the final, gruesome chapter in its already morbid history. The incident cemented its reputation as a cursed and dangerous place, and in 2017, it closed its doors for a massive renovation and rebranding, eventually reopening in late 2021 in an attempt to finally shed its past. The case also became a landmark moment in the culture of online true crime, demonstrating the immense power of internet communities to bring global attention to a case, but also their potential to spread misinformation and harass those tangentially involved. The story has been immortalized in pop culture, most notably inspiring a season of the television series American Horror Story and becoming the subject of a widely watched 2021 Netflix documentary. Ultimately, when the layers of mystery, conspiracy, and paranormal speculation are peeled away, what remains is the tragic story of one person. The case of Alyssa Lamb serves as a stark and devastating reminder of the profound dangers of severe mental illness when it goes untreated. It is a story about a young woman who went looking for adventure but was ultimately consumed by an internal struggle she could no longer control. Her final, bizarre moments, captured for the world to see, were not an act in a horror movie, but the desperate, confused actions of a mind in crisis, leading to a lonely death in the most unimaginable of places. Case 3. Sunday, the 6th of May, 1956, began like any other in the small market town of Ormskirk, Lancashire. But for one resident, a sense of unease was slowly starting to build. Josephine Mary Whitehouse, a neighbor and close friend of the Ormisher sisters, followed her usual Sunday morning routine. At 10:30 a.m., she prepared some tea and walked over to the tobacco and confectionery shop on Church Street, a business owned and run by the two elderly sisters, Margaret and Mary. But when she arrived, she found the door was still locked. This was unusual. The shop was always open by this time. And later, at 11:30 a.m., with still no sign of life at the shop, a genuine worry began to set in. The neighbor made the decision to walk to the sister's home, a 10-room house named Ivy Dean at number 8 a small lane. She knocked on the front door, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet street. There was no answer. She called out for them, but only silence replied. Her anxiety growing, she noticed another neighbor, Thomas Patrick Cummins, standing outside his home at number 6. She explained her concerns, and together, they decided to go around to the back of the house. The house sat adjacent to a shared space known as Brickmaker's Arms Yard. As they entered the private backyard belonging to Ivy Dean, the neighbor, Mrs. Whitehouse, saw something on the ground that made her stop breathing for a second. It was blood. She let out a scream. The second neighbor, Mr. Cummins, acted quickly. He saw that the back door was slightly ajar. He told Mrs. Whitehouse to stay put and pushed the door open, peering inside. What he saw in the kitchen confirmed his worst fears. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. He immediately understood the gravity of the situation, stepping back out and blocking the doorway to shield the neighbor from the horror within. She looked at him, her face filled with dread. He shook his head slowly and said the words that would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the town for decades. They're gone. By 11:58 a.m., the police had been called. The tragedy had been discovered. To understand the depth of the shock that rippled through Ormskirk, one must first understand who the Ormesher sisters were. They were an institution in the town, fixtures of daily life. Margaret Jane Ormesher, the elder sister, was 68 years old, born in 1888. Her sister, Mary, was 67, born just a year later. Both were spinsters, unmarried and having lived their entire lives in the same small community. They were physically diminutive women, both standing under 5 feet tall, with Margaret having a shock of white hair. They were described by everyone who knew them as gentle, harmless, helpful souls who would never hurt anyone. For years, they had run their small shop, a place where locals would stop for cigarettes, newspapers, and sweets. Mary was the primary manager of the business, while Margaret assisted. They were beloved, quiet figures in a town where everyone knew everyone else. Their lives were governed by routine. Every evening, Mary would close up the shop and walk the short distance home. Because she didn't carry a key to the front door of Ivy Dean, she would knock, and Margaret would let her in from the inside. But for nearly 6 years, Mary had not made that walk alone. Her friend and neighbor from the flat above the shop, the same Josephine Whitehouse who would later discover the crime, had made it a habit to accompany Mary on her walk home every single night. It was a comforting ritual, a simple act of friendship to ensure her safety in the dark. This routine was born out of a quiet concern. Years earlier, around 1950, the local police had received some intelligence suggesting a possible plot to rob the sisters. The threat was never substantiated, but the police took it seriously enough to visit the women and advise them to be careful. This advice, coupled with the natural anxieties of 2 elderly women living alone, had led to the nightly escort provided by the trusted neighbor. For almost 6 years, this system had worked flawlessly. Mary was never alone on her way home, until Saturday, May 5, 1956. The first indication that someone was waiting for a break in this routine, came not from an adult, but from a child. An 11-year-old boy named James B. Houghton lived at 37 a small lane. His home gave him a clear view of the corner where a small lane met Whiterails Drive, a key point on Mary Ormesher's route home. On the evening of Wednesday, May 2nd, 3 days before the murders, the young witness was looking out his window at about 10 past 10 at night. His attention was drawn to a man standing on the corner. The man wasn't doing anything overtly criminal, but his presence felt out of place. He was just standing there, looking down the street, in the direction from which Mary would typically appear. The boy was observant and later provided police with a remarkably detailed description. The man was of medium build, standing at an estimated 5 feet tall. He had a long, thin face with high cheekbones and was clean-shaven. His dark hair was long and fell across his forehead. He was wearing a light-colored, double-breasted Macintosh coat with a belt and gray trousers. But the most distinctive feature was his transportation. Leaning against the wall next to him was a light blue racing bicycle. The boy noted that it looked quite new, with dropped handlebars and white mudguards. The man and his bicycle were a peculiar sight on the quiet residential corner late at night. One sighting might have been a coincidence. But the next night, Thursday, May 3rd, the boy looked out his window again at around the same time, 10:10 p.m. The same man was there. Standing in the same spot, next to the same light blue racing bicycle, staring in the same direction. The night after that, Friday, May 4th, it happened again. For 3 consecutive nights, the mysterious man had maintained his vigil, patiently observing the routine, learning the schedule. He was watching for something, or rather, for someone. It was clear this was not a random presence. This was surveillance. Then came Saturday, May 5th. On this particular evening, the 6-year-long routine was finally broken. The neighbor, Josephine Whitehouse, and her husband had decided to take a trip to the nearby seaside town of Southport for the evening. When they returned, the Ormishers' shop was already closed and locked for the night. For the first time in nearly 6 years, Mary Ormisher would have to walk home alone. As she closed up the shop, between 10:10 p.m. and 10:25 p.m., Mary began her solitary journey. Multiple witnesses saw her that night, a small, elderly woman walking with purpose through the familiar streets. In her right hand, she carried a brown leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the entire week's takings from the shop, a sum of approximately £150. In today's money, that would be the equivalent of several £1,000s. She walked along Househall Lane, a familiar route. At 10:18 p.m., another neighbor who lived in the Brickmaker's Arms yard behind the Ormisher house was returning home. As he approached, he noticed a strange man standing across the street, just washing. The description was vague, but the presence of a loiterer so close to the sisters' home, at the exact time Mary was walking back, was another piece of a puzzle that would only be assembled in hindsight. Mary continued her walk, unaware of the eyes that had been tracking her for days, unaware that the predator who had been waiting so patiently had finally found his opportunity. She was just a few minutes from the safety of her front door, where her sister Margaret was waiting to let her in, just as she had done thousands of times before. As Mary Ormisher made her final turn onto a small lane, the familiar sight of her home, Ivy Dean, was likely a welcome one. But the man who had been washing for 3 nights was now presented with his perfect opportunity. The street was dark, it was late, and for the first time in years, the victim was completely alone. What happened next was never seen by any witness, but it was heard. Between approximately 11:15 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., the quiet of the neighborhood was broken by a series of disturbing sounds emanating from number 8. Several neighbors, accustomed to the peaceful stillness of their street, were alerted by the commotion. They reported hearing groaning sounds, the unmistakable noise of distress. They heard voices, both male and female, though the words were indistinct. There was the sharp, violent sound of glass shattering, and then a distinct clatter, later identified as the sound of a metal dustbin lid being knocked over and hitting the ground. These were the audible footprints of a brutal struggle, a life-or-death fight happening just a few yards away from them. Yet, in an era before emergency numbers were commonplace, and with a reluctance to interfere in what might have been perceived as a domestic dispute, no one called the police. The sounds eventually faded, and an unnatural silence fell over Ivy Dean once more. The pathologist, Dr. George B. Manning, would later estimate that the time of death for both sisters was around midnight, corroborating the timeline provided by the neighbors' ears. When detectives from the Lancashire Constabulary stepped into the kitchen of Ivy Dean the next morning, they were confronted with a scene of utter savagery. This was not a clean, professional crime. It was a frenzied, chaotic, and exceptionally violent assault. The 2 small, elderly sisters were found in the kitchen. Both were still fully dressed in their daily clothes, including the sweaters and cardigans they wore for warmth. The room itself told the story of the struggle. Blood was everywhere. It was smeared on the walls, and it had spattered across a stack of astrology magazines, a poignant and tragic detail that spoke to the sisters' quiet hobbies, now forever stained by the violence that ended their lives. The evidence suggested the attack had been ferocious and prolonged. Investigators noted that the body of the elder sister, Margaret, showed signs of having been dragged from the backyard back into the kitchen, indicating the confrontation may have begun the moment Mary arrived at her door. In the middle of this chaos, on the kitchen table, lay the brown leather briefcase Mary had been carrying. It was open. Inside were 2 money bags. One, containing £50 in coins, had been left untouched. The other bag was gone. It had contained an estimated £100 in cash, the bulk of the week's earnings. The motive appeared to be robbery. However, this theory was immediately complicated by what the police found, or rather, didn't find in the rest of the house. A thorough search of the other 9 rooms revealed no signs of ransacking. Nothing had been disturbed. More tellingly, investigators discovered larger sums of money tucked away in tins in other rooms, all of it untouched. The killer had taken the £100 from the briefcase and fled, ignoring a potentially larger prize. This suggested he was either in a hurry, was panicked, or had specifically targeted only the cash he knew Mary was carrying. The violence seemed wildly disproportionate to the amount of money stolen. The brutality was not limited to the human occupants. Underneath the kitchen table, officers found the sisters' beloved black spaniel, Trixie. The dog had been struck with a single, heavy blow to the head and was found in a terrible state, alive but severely injured. The attacker, in his frenzy, had seemingly attempted to eliminate any living thing that could bear witness to his crime. The search for the murder weapons did not take long. The killer had not brought a weapon with him. He had improvised, using the very objects from the sisters' own kitchen against them. The investigators identified 3 improvised weapons, all of them showing the signs of a desperate and forceful struggle. The first was a large, heavy brass fire poker. It had been used with such incredible force that its decorative head had snapped off, and its solid metal shaft was bent. The second and third weapons were a pair of brass candlesticks. They too had been used to bludgeon the victims, struck so hard that their bases had shattered from the impact. A broken wine bottle was also found, its jagged edges suggesting it too had been used in the assault. The use of these ad hoc weapons painted a picture of a robbery that had escalated horrifically, perhaps when the killer was recognized or when the sisters fought back. The formal results of the post-mortem examination, conducted by Dr. George B. Manning, a pathologist from the Home Office Forensic Science Laboratory in Preston, confirmed the visual. Both Margaret and Mary Ormesher had died from severe head injuries consistent with multiple blows from a blunt object. Dr. Manning's report emphasized that the injuries had been inflicted with very great force, a clinical term that barely captured the sheer brutality of the attack on the 2 frail women. With the crime scene processed and the cause of death established, the largest murder investigation in Lancashire's history up to that point began. The initial focus was on 2 things: identifying the man with the light blue bicycle and finding a match for the single most important piece of forensic evidence left at the scene. Amidst the blood and chaos of the kitchen, investigators had found one clear, bloody fingerprint. The print did not belong to Margaret, nor did it belong to Mary. It belonged to their killer. This single fingerprint became the central hope of the entire investigation, a tangible link to the phantom who had committed this terrible crime. The police response was massive and methodical. Detectives began a painstaking process of house-to-house inquiries, fanning out across the entire town of Ormskirk. They interviewed thousands of residents, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious on the night of the murder, if they knew of anyone with a grudge against the sisters, or if they recognized the description of the man and his distinctive bicycle. The information provided by the young witness, James Houghton, was considered the strongest lead. Appeals were made to the public for any information about a man fitting that description. Simultaneously, the investigation took a pioneering and unprecedented step for the time. In a massive effort to identify the owner of the bloody fingerprint, the Lancashire Constabulary decided to fingerprint the entire adult male population of Ormskirk. It was a Herculean task. Officers went door to door, setting up temporary stations to collect prints from every man over the age of 18. Thousands upon thousands of fingerprints were taken, each one carefully compared against the bloody print from the crime scene. The entire town cooperated, hoping that this exhaustive process would surely unmask the killer living among them, or someone who had passed through. But as the weeks turned into months, a frustrating and chilling reality began to set in. Not a single fingerprint match. The bloody print from the kitchen of Ivy Dean did not belong to a man on record in Ormskirk. The investigation had hit a dead end. Their best piece of evidence, the one thing that should have led them directly to the murderer, had instead only deepened the mystery. The killer, it seemed, had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all, with their single best piece of forensic evidence, the bloody fingerprint, leading them nowhere, and the mysterious man on the light blue racing bicycle having vanished without a trace. The Lancashire Constabulary had to explore every other possible avenue, no matter how unlikely. The investigation branched out, chasing down theories and rumors in a desperate attempt to find a new lead. Detectives looked into the activities of teddy boys, youth gangs from the larger, industrial city of Liverpool who were known to travel to smaller towns on weekends. The theory was that a group might have come to Ormskirk looking for trouble and targeted the sisters for a robbery, which then spiraled out of control. But extensive inquiries in Liverpool and checks on known offenders yielded nothing. No connections could be made. They delved into the sisters' past, creating a list of every person who had lodged with them as an evacuee during the Second World War. The police painstakingly tracked down these individuals, now adults scattered across the country, to see if any of them held a grudge or had fallen on hard times and returned with criminal intent. This line of inquiry also proved fruitless. Every former evacuee was accounted for, and none emerged as a vital suspect. K-9 units were brought in to conduct wide-ranging searches of the fields, canals, and alleyways surrounding Ormskirk, hoping to find the discarded murder weapons, the stolen money bag, or the killer's distinctive Macintosh coat. The dogs found nothing of evidentiary value. Meanwhile, the town itself was a hotbed of speculation. A persistent rumor began to circulate that the two unassuming sisters were actually secret moneylenders who kept a small fortune hidden inside a grandfather clock in their home. This theory suggested a motive far greater than the pound 100 that was stolen. Investigators took the rumor seriously enough to investigate it thoroughly, but they ultimately dismissed it. They confirmed that while the sisters did occasionally lend small sums of money to a few trusted business friends, they were by no means wealthy financiers, and there was no hidden treasure in their house. As the months dragged on with no breakthroughs, the massive investigation slowly wound down. The case of the Ormesher sisters' murder went cold. For the town of Ormskirk, the aftermath was a permanent scar. The brutal murder of two of its most gentle and beloved residents had shattered the community's sense of safety and innocence. A palpable fear lingered. People who had never thought twice about leaving their doors unlocked began to secure them diligently. The story became a local cautionary tale, a dark chapter in the town's history passed down through generations. Avideen, the house at number 8 A Small Lane, stood empty for years, a silent monument to the tragedy it had hosted. No one wanted to live there. It was eventually demolished, its physical presence erased, though its memory remained. For years, the case file sat in storage, a thick collection of witness statements, forensic reports, and thousands of unmatched fingerprints. It seemed destined to remain one of Lancashire's most infamous unsolved crimes. Then, in February of 1983, nearly 27 years after the murders, the telephone rang in the office of a Manchester newspaper. An anonymous man was on the line. He was elderly, estimated to be in his 70s, and he spoke with a heavy heart. He told the journalist that he knew the identity of the Ormesher sisters' killer. He claimed that he had held this information for decades, and the guilt of his silence had finally become too much to bear. He then gave a name. The newspaper immediately contacted the Lancashire Criminal Investigation Department. The old, dusty file was pulled from the archives and the case was officially reopened. Investigators pursued this new lead with renewed vigor. They looked into the individual who had been named by the anonymous caller. But once again, the promising lead dissolved into a dead end. The renewed investigation did not result in any arrests or charges. The police never publicly released the name of the suspect or the specific reasons why the investigation stalled. It's possible the named individual had passed away in the intervening years, or that after nearly 3 decades, there was simply not enough corroborating evidence to build a case that would stand up in court. The tantalizing tip, which had offered a brief glimmer of hope for a resolution, ultimately led back to the same frustrating silence. To this day, the killer of Margaret and Mary Ormesher has never been officially identified. All that remains is a profile, a ghost built from the evidence and observations left behind. The unsub is a male, likely young to middle-aged at the time, given the physical strength required for the attack. We know, from the young witness, his approximate height, his thin face, his dark hair, and his tidy, clean-shaven appearance. We know he wore a light-colored Macintosh and rode a distinctive light blue racing bicycle. His behavior suggests a man who was both patient and explosively violent. He was calculating enough to observe his victim's routine for at least 3 nights, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when she was alone. This demonstrates premeditation. He knew who carried the money and when. He was familiar enough with the area to know the layout of the streets and the access to the back of the house. Yet the crime itself was not a clean one. The extreme, disproportionate violence and the use of improvised weapons from the scene suggest a man who may have lost control. Perhaps he was recognized by one of the sisters, causing him to panic and lash out with savage force to silence them. His actions after the attack are also contradictory. He was controlled enough to take the cash from the briefcase but left behind other money, and most importantly, he left behind his fingerprint. This suggests he fled in a hurry, perhaps startled by the very noise that the neighbors heard. The murder of the Ormesher sisters remains one of Lancashire's most notorious cold cases. It leaves behind a trail of deeply unsettling, unanswered questions. Who was the man on the bicycle, and how did he and his memorable vehicle disappear so completely from a small town where everyone knew everyone? Why did the bloody fingerprint, the killer's calling card, never match anyone in the massive screening or in any police database since? Was the motive truly just the pound 100 in the briefcase, or was there a more personal, hidden reason for such a brutal attack? And what of the anonymous caller in 1983? Was his information genuine, a final attempt at a clear conscience, or was it a false lead born of decades of rumor and speculation? We will likely never know. The case file remains open. In theory, a resolution is still possible. Advances in DNA technology or a future match in a global fingerprint database could, one day, finally put a name to the blueprint found in the kitchen of Ivy Dean. Until that day, the file remains a testament to a brutal crime and an enduring mystery, a story of two gentle sisters whose quiet lives were ended by a violent phantom who appeared for 1 week in May and then vanished forever. Case 4. In the early summer of 2007, the city of Grand Junction, Colorado, was draped in the familiar warmth of the coming season. For 20-year-old Paige Autumn Bergfeld, this time of year represented more than just a change in weather. It was the promise of a new beginning. She was a young mother, and her world revolved around her 3-year-old son, Frank. Those who knew her described a personality that shone as brightly as the Colorado sun, vibrant, energetic, and full of life. Her smile was a constant, a reflection of a spirit that seemed determined to find joy in the everyday moments of motherhood. She was in the process of securing a new apartment, a space that was meant to be a sanctuary for her and her little boy, a place to build a future on their own terms. This desire for a fresh start was born from a history of turbulence. Her relationship with the father of her child, 23-year-old Christopher Wilson, had been a long and difficult chapter. It was a classic story of an on-again, off-again romance, a cycle of passionate arguments followed by fragile reconciliations. But recently, something within the young mother had shifted. She had made the firm decision to close that chapter for good. She had started seeing someone new, a gentle step into a different future, and the new apartment was a tangible symbol of her independence. For Paige, life was moving forward. Sunday, June 24, 2007, began like any other Sunday. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Candlewood Apartments where the young mother lived. At around 5 o'clock in the evening, a familiar car pulled into the complex. It was her ex-boyfriend, Christopher Wilson. He was there for a routine and agreed-upon reason, to pick up their son, Frank, for his scheduled time with his father. To any observer, the scene would have appeared perfectly normal, separated couple navigating the logistics of co-parenting. The ex-boyfriend arrived, exchanged a few words with the mother, and left with their child. This brief, mundane interaction would later become the single most critical moment in a timeline of terror, as it was the last time anyone could independently verify seeing Paige Bergfeld alive. As Sunday evening bled into Monday morning, a quiet unease began to. Paige's mother, Connie Fluke, was exceptionally close with her daughter. They spoke constantly, their lives interwoven through daily calls and text messages. So, when Monday came and went with no word from her daughter, the mother felt a small knot of worry tighten in her stomach. She called her daughter's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She sent text messages that were met with digital silence. This was not like her daughter. The young mother was devoted to her son, and she would never be out of touch, especially when he was with his father. By Tuesday, June 26th, the knot of worry had grown into a heavy stone of dread. Every call, every message went unanswered. The silence was deafening, a stark and terrifying contrast to her daughter's usually bubbly and responsive nature. The mother's intuition told her something was profoundly wrong. A mother knows her child's rhythms, and this complete break in communication was an alarm bell she could no longer ignore. On Wednesday, June 27th, after 3 agonizing days of silence, Connie Fluke walked into the Grand Junction Police Department and officially reported her 20-year-old daughter missing. The initial response from law enforcement was methodical. They began the standard procedure for a missing person case, especially one involving a young mother. Patrol officers likely visited the Candlewood apartment, finding no signs of Paige but also no obvious signs of a struggle. They began making calls, speaking to friends and family, trying to piece together a picture of her last known movements. And at the top of that list of people to speak with was the last person known to have seen her. Her ex-boyfriend, the father of her child. The investigation, however, was about to be violently ripped from the realm of missing persons and thrown into the dark reality of a homicide. The very next day, on the morning of Thursday, June 28, miles away from the quiet apartment complex, the case took a grim and irreversible turn. The location was a world away from the victim's life, a remote, arid, and desolate stretch of desert in Mesa County, near the Garfield County line. It was a place of scrub brush and dry earth, frequented only by those who worked in the region's oil and gas fields. An employee of the Halliburton Company was making his rounds, his vehicle kicking up dust on a lonely access road. It was then that he noticed something out of place. A patch of disturbed earth, a shallow depression that looked like a hastily dug grave. He immediately alerted the authorities. Sheriff's deputies from Mesa County responded to the desolate location. The scene was treated with caution as they began the slow, careful process of excavating the area. As they removed the loose dirt, a splash of color appeared. It was fabric. They continued to dig, and soon the full object was unearthed. It was the body of a young woman, wrapped tightly inside a large, colorful comforter. There was little doubt as to who it was. The search for the missing mother was over. The discovery shifted the entire focus of the police effort. The Grand Junction Police Department, now working with the Mesa County Sheriff's Office, launched a full-scale homicide investigation. The victim's body was transported to the coroner's office, where a medical examiner performed an autopsy. The findings were chilling and unambiguous. Paige Birdfeld had died from asphyxiation as a result of manual strangulation. The examination also revealed signs of a physical struggle, confirming that her final moments had been violent and terrifying. She had fought for her life. With the cause of death established, investigators turned their full attention back to the place where her life had likely ended, her apartment. When forensic investigators entered her home at the Candlewood complex, they were immediately struck by something odd. It wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. The apartment was clean. In fact, it was suspiciously clean. A strong, pungent odor of chemical cleaning agents hung heavy in the air, a scent that screamed of a desperate attempt to erase evidence. It was the smell of a cover-up. As the investigators meticulously processed the apartment, they focused on the victim's bedroom. It was there they made a pivotal discovery. The comforter from her bed was gone. Her mother, Connie, was asked to describe the missing bedding. Her description, a distinctive, colorful comforter, was a perfect match for the one that had been found wrapped around her daughter's body in the lonely desert grave. This was the first major breakthrough, a direct, physical link between the place where the victim was disposed of and the primary crime scene. The killer had taken a trophy, or rather a tool, from the scene of the crime and used it to conceal his horrific act. The investigators continued their search, their trained eyes scanning for anything out of place. In the kitchen, they noted a roll of trash bags. They were a specific brand, Hefty Cinch Sack. They also noticed that several bags were missing from the roll. At the time, it was a minor detail, a small observation in a sea of more pressing evidence. But in the days to come, this seemingly insignificant roll of plastic bags would become one of the most important clues in the entire investigation, a silent witness that would ultimately help unravel a carefully constructed web of lies. By the end of the day on June 28th, the picture was becoming clear. The young mother had been murdered in her own home, her body wrapped in her own blanket and dumped in the desert. The scene had been scrubbed clean, and the last person to see her alive was her ex-boyfriend. With the victim's apartment now definitively identified as the primary crime scene, the focus of the investigation sharpened and narrowed onto a single individual. All evidence, logic, and experience pointed directly at the last person known to have seen Paige Birdfeld alive, her 23-year-old ex-boyfriend and the father of her child, Christopher Wilson. He was brought in for a formal interview, a critical step in any homicide investigation. The detectives who sat across from him were prepared for a range of reactions: denial, anger, grief, but the suspect's demeanor was unsettling in its composure. He was calm, articulate, and outwardly cooperative. He presented an image of a concerned ex-partner, worried about the mother of his son, and willing to help the police in any way he could. He readily admitted the details of his visit on that Sunday afternoon. He confirmed that he had arrived at the Candlewood Apartments around 5 o'clock to pick up his son, Frank, just as they had planned. He told investigators that he and the victim had a brief, unremarkable conversation before he left with the boy. He insisted that when he drove away, she was alive and well, and that was the last time he saw her. When the detectives pressed him for his whereabouts for the remainder of that critical evening, the time frame in which the medical examiner believed the murder had occurred, the suspect did not hesitate. He provided a clear, simple, and powerful alibi. He stated that he had spent the entire evening in the company of his mother, Sandy Wilson. An alibi provided by a suspect's own mother is often viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism by seasoned investigators. The maternal instinct to protect a child can be a powerful motivator to bend the truth. However, it still had to be treated as credible until proven otherwise. The investigators' next move was clear. They had to speak with the mother. Sandy Wilson was brought in for questioning, ostensibly to verify her son's account of his time on that Sunday night. She presented herself as a concerned mother, worried about the terrible situation her son had found himself in. When asked about her son's whereabouts, her story was a perfect mirror of his. She told the investigators, with confidence, that her son, Christopher, had been with her throughout the entire evening of Sunday, June 24th. She corroborated every detail, effectively building a wall of confirmation around her son's alibi. The investigation had hit its first major roadblock. On one hand, the circumstantial evidence was mounting against the ex-boyfriend. He had the motive jealousy over the victim's new relationship and her plans to move on. He had the opportunity. He was at her apartment right before she disappeared. And the crime scene itself, scrubbed clean with chemicals, pointed to a perpetrator who had something to hide, not a random stranger. Yet, on the other hand, there was a seemingly unbreakable alibi, vouched for by a credible witness. For a brief period, the case was at a standstill. The detectives' instincts told them the son was their killer, but the mother's testimony kept them at bay. They knew that to get to the son, they first had to find a way through the wall his mother had built around him. The investigators made a crucial decision. Instead of hammering away at the suspect, who remained cool and consistent in his denials, they decided to shift their focus and scrutinize the alibi witness herself. They began to dig into the life and activities of Sandy Wilson. They operated on the theory that if the alibi was a lie, there must be some evidence, some digital or physical footprint, that could expose it. They began the patient, methodical work of pulling her financial records, searching for any transaction made on that Sunday. They were looking for a single receipt, a single charge that would place her somewhere other than at home with her son. The painstaking search paid off. Buried in a list of transactions, they found it. A single debit card purchase made on the evening of Sunday, June 24th, at a local Walmart in Grand Junction. The time stamp on the transaction fell squarely within the window that she claimed to have been at home with her son. This was the first crack in the fortress of their alibi. It proved, at the very least, that she had not been with him for the entire evening. She had left the house and gone shopping, but a receipt alone wasn't enough. The investigators needed something more, something visual and undeniable. They immediately contacted the Walmart store's loss prevention department and requested the security surveillance footage from the night of the purchase. In a darkened room, the investigators gathered around a monitor and watched the black and white footage from that Sunday night. The video confirmed the receipt. It showed Sandy Wilson entering the store and walking through the aisles, but it also revealed something far more significant. She was completely alone. Her son, the man she swore she had been with all evening, was nowhere to be seen. The surveillance video had just shattered the core of the suspect's alibi, but the most damning evidence was yet to come. The investigators continued to watch, tracking her movements through the store. They followed her as she selected her items and proceeded to the checkout lane. As she placed her purchases on the conveyor belt, the camera angle provided a clear view of what was in her cart. And there it was. One of the items she purchased was a box of trash bags. The investigators zoomed in, the grainy image becoming clearer. The brand name on the box was perfectly legible, Hefty Cinch Sack. It was a stunning moment of revelation. The exact same, specific brand of trash bags they had noted in the victim's kitchen, with several bags missing from the roll, was the very brand the suspect's mother had purchased on the night of the murder, at a time when she claimed to be somewhere else. It was the piece of evidence that connected everything. The mother's lie was not just a passive act of covering for her son's time. It was an active participation in the aftermath of the crime. The purchase of those bags was almost certainly for the purpose of cleaning the crime scene, of disposing of evidence soaked in the victim's blood or DNA. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, the investigators called Sandy Wilson back in for a second interview. The atmosphere this time was entirely different. There was no more pretense of a routine inquiry. The detectives likely began by asking her to recount her story one more time, giving her a final chance to tell the truth. Predictably, she repeated the lie, sticking to the alibi that had, up until that moment, protected her son. Then, the investigators laid their cards on the table. They presented the Walmart receipt. They showed her the still images from the surveillance video, showing her shopping, alone. And then, they delivered the final, crushing blow, the photograph of the hefty cinch-sack trash bags in her shopping cart. Faced with the undeniable, visual proof of her deceit, the mother's composure completely disintegrated. The wall she had built came crashing down. She broke down, and through tears, the truth finally came pouring out. She confessed that she had lied to them. She had lied to protect her son. She recounted the true events of that Sunday night. She had not been with Christopher. Instead, she had received a phone call from him, and he was in a state of absolute panic. He told her that he had gone to Paige's apartment, and they had gotten into a terrible argument. The argument, he confessed, was about Paige's new relationship and her plans to move out and start a new life. In a fit of rage, he admitted to his mother, had choked her. He had strangled the mother of his child to death. Her confession didn't end there. She went on to admit that her role was far greater than just providing a false alibi. After her son's panic call, she drove to the victim's apartment. But she didn't go to render aid or to call the police. She went to help her son erase his crime. She admitted to actively participating in the cleanup, using harsh chemical cleaners to scrub away any trace of the violent struggle that had taken place. The trash bags she bought at Walmart were for disposing of the cleaning materials and any other items that could link her son to the murder. With her confession, Sandy Wilson transformed herself from a protective mother into an accessory to murder. The confession of Sandy Wilson was the seismic event that demolished her son's entire defense. With her detailed, corroborated statement, investigators for the Grand Junction Police Department now had everything they needed. The wall that the mother had built around her son had not just been breached. She had handed the police the sledgehammer to tear it down herself. Christopher Wilson was arrested and brought back to the interrogation room. The atmosphere was no longer one of cautious inquiry. The time for questions was over. The time for accountability had arrived. The suspect, who had previously been so calm and collected, was now confronted with an inescapable reality. The investigators laid out the case against him, piece by undeniable piece. They spoke of the suspiciously clean apartment and the missing company. They detailed the discovery in the desert. They then presented the evidence that had unraveled his alibi, the Walmart receipt, the surveillance footage of his mother shopping alone, and the damning image of the hefty cinch-sack trash bags. And then, they delivered the final, fatal blow. They told him that his mother, his sole alibi and protector, had confessed to everything. They recounted her story of his panicked phone call, his admission of guilt, and her own role in the cover-up. For the suspect, it was the ultimate betrayal and the end of the line. The foundation of his lies had been obliterated by the one person he thought he could count on. Faced with this mountain of evidence, and with no one left to protect him, Christopher Wilson's composure finally shattered. The facade of the concerned ex-boyfriend evaporated, revealing the killer beneath. He abandoned his denials, and, at last, he confessed to the murder of Paige Birdfell. He recounted the events of that Sunday evening, confirming the investigators' darkest theories. He described the argument that had erupted between him and the 20-year-old mother. It was, as his mother had said, about Paige's future that no longer included him. He was enraged by her new relationship and her concrete plans to move into a new apartment, to create a new life for herself and their son. He saw her independence not as a natural progression, but as a personal rejection, an intolerable loss of control. He told police that in the heat of his fury, the argument escalated with terrifying speed. His anger boiled over into physical violence. He lunged at her, and, in an act of intimate brutality, he wrapped his hands around her neck and squeezed the life out of her. He admitted to strangling her to death right there in the perceived safety of her own home. In a detail that adds another layer of horror to the crime, it is believed that their 3-year-old son, Frank, was present in another room of the small apartment while his mother was being murdered by his father. What the child may have heard or understood in those terrible moments is a question that can never be fully answered. After the act, the killer's rage was replaced by panic. He looked at what he had done, and his immediate instinct was not remorse, but self-preservation. His first call was not to 911, but to his mother, seeking help in covering his crime. He described wrapping the victim's body in the colorful comforter from her bed, tearing her out to his vehicle under the cover of darkness, and driving out to the desolate spot in the desert. There, he dug a shallow grave and buried the young woman he once claimed to love, hoping she would never be found. With his confession, the psychological portrait of the killer came into sharp focus. His actions were a textbook example of possessiveness and control. The murder was not just a result of a fleeting argument. It was the catastrophic conclusion of his inability to accept the victim's autonomy. When she asserted her right to move on, to find happiness elsewhere, he perceived it as an ultimate betrayal that he could not tolerate. His solution was to exert the ultimate form of control, ensuring that if he could not have her, no one could. The choice of strangulation is profoundly significant. It is a deeply personal and intimate method of killing, requiring direct, sustained physical contact. It represents a final, desperate assertion of power and dominance over a victim in their most vulnerable moments. His ability to then go about his life for several days, to feign concern and cooperate calmly with police, revealed a chilling capacity for deception and a profound lack of immediate remorse. His confession was not an act of a guilty conscience seeking redemption. It was the last move of a cornered man with no other options. The legal process moved swiftly following the confessions. Christopher Wilson was charged with first-degree murder. Facing the overwhelming evidence against him and the possibility of receiving the death penalty in a trial, he accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to the charge of first-degree murder. In exchange for his plea, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never again be a free man. His mother, Sandy Wilson, faced her own day in court. She was charged with multiple felonies, including accessory to a crime, attempting to influence a public servant, and tampering with physical evidence. Having cooperated with prosecutors after her initial lie was exposed, she also accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to the charge of accessory to a crime. In a decision that many found controversial, she was sentenced to probation and community service. The mother who actively helped cover up a brutal murder was allowed to walk free, while the son she tried to protect would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case was officially closed, but the consequences of that single act of violence continued to ripple outward. For the victim's family, especially her mother, Connie Fluke, the loss created a wound that will never truly heal. Her grandson, Frank, was left to grow up without his mother, raised by a grandmother who had to somehow explain the unexplainable. He is the forgotten victim of this tragedy, a little boy whose father murdered his mother. The case of Paige Birdfeld's murder shocked the community of Grand Junction and garnered national media attention. It was featured on true crime television shows like Dateline NBC, in an episode titled The Pink Comforter Mystery, and on Investigation Discovery's See No Evil, in an episode called The Comforter. These programs brought widespread awareness to the story, highlighting the ultimate danger that can face victims of domestic abuse. Paige Birdfeld was killed at the single most dangerous moment for a person in a volatile relationship, the moment she tried to leave. In the end, this is a story of profound and multifaceted tragedy. It is the story of a young mother, vibrant and full of hope for a new beginning, whose future was stolen from her in an act of jealous rage. It is the story of a mother's love so twisted and misguided that it made her an accomplice to murder, choosing to protect her killer son over seeking justice for his victim. And it is a story that serves as a chilling reminder of how the most mundane objects, a simple store receipt, a security camera, and a box of trash bags, can become the unlikeliest of heroes, silent witnesses that expose a killer's secrets and finally bring the truth to light. Case 5. In February of 2018, two sisters from Latvia traveled to the tranquil shores of Kerala, a state in southern India often marketed to the world as God's own country. They weren't there for the famous beaches or the lush backwaters that draw millions of tourists each year. They were on a mission of healing. The older sister, a 33-year-old woman named Liga Scramain, had been living in Dublin, Ireland, for the past 5 years with her life partner. She was described by those who knew her as a gentle, somewhat introverted person who loved gardening and the outdoors. But beneath this quiet exterior, she was fighting a profound and difficult battle with severe depression, a struggle that had previously pushed her to the edge. Hoping to find a path back to mental wellness, she and her younger sister, Bils, had come to this place to attend a 6-week wellness retreat at a traditional Ayurveda treatment center near the popular Kovalam beach. They had placed their hope in ancient practices, seeking peace and recovery in a foreign land. For the first few weeks, the routine of the center seemed to offer a fragile sense of stability. The days were structured around yoga, meditation, and holistic treatments. On the morning of March 14th, however, that routine was broken. The victim told her sister she was suffering from a headache and would be skipping the morning yoga session. This was the last conversation the two sisters would ever have. Sometime around 11:30 a.m., the victim left the wellness center alone. She was dressed in yoga leggings and a t-shirt. She hailed a local auto rickshaw, a 3-wheeled taxi, and asked the driver to take her to Kovalam Beach, a short distance away. She carried with her about 2,000 rupees, the equivalent of roughly $25. Crucially, she left her passport, her handbag, and the rest of her belongings behind in her room. It was not the act of someone planning a long journey. When the sister returned to their room later that day, she found it empty. At first, she wasn't alarmed, assuming her older sister had simply gone for a walk and would be back soon. But as the afternoon faded into evening, and then into a deep, anxious night, there was still no sign of her. A gnawing worry began to set in. The sister went out, walking the length of the beach until late into the night, showing a photograph to strangers, asking if anyone had seen the tall, distinctive European woman. No one had. The following day, March 15th, with her sister still missing, she went to the local police station to officially file a missing person report. The response she received from the local authorities would become a defining feature of the case, a source of immense frustration and pain for the family. Instead of launching an immediate and serious investigation, the police were dismissive. They suggested that the missing woman was just another foreign tourist who had likely decided to wander off on her own for a few days of adventure. They speculated that she might have gone with a new friend, or perhaps taken a spontaneous trip to a nearby ashram. They assured the frantic sister that this sort of thing happened all the time, and that the missing woman would almost certainly turn up within a day or two, once her excursion was over. For 10 agonizing days, the police took almost no meaningful action. The official investigation was, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. Faced with this institutional apathy, the family realized they were on their own. The victim's life partner, an Irishman named Andrew Jordan, immediately flew from Dublin to India to join the search. Together, he and the sister mounted an extraordinary campaign, a desperate, grassroots effort to find the woman they loved. They refused to let her disappearance be ignored. They printed over 3,000 posters with her face on them, traveling up and down the coast, plastering them in every town, village, and shop they could find. They offered a 100,000 rupee reward for any information. They organized press conferences, speaking to any local or international journalist who would listen, trying to generate as much media attention as possible. The sister even reached out directly to India's Minister of External Affairs on Twitter, pleading for help. The life partner, driven by a belief that she had been abducted by local criminal gangs, took the immense risk of trying to infiltrate these groups himself, seeking whispers or clues about her whereabouts. Their relentless efforts began to generate pressure. The story of the missing Latvian woman started to gain traction in the media, both in India and international. The stark contrast between the family's desperate, round-the-clock search and the casual indifference of the local police became a narrative in itself. Under the glare of this growing spotlight, the authorities were finally compelled to act. The search was escalated, with the Indian Navy and Air Force being called in to conduct searches of the coastline and the sea. Though these efforts turned up nothing, the police continued to float their theories, suggesting the victim had taken her own life due to her history of depression, or that she had simply run away. These were theories the family vehemently rejected. They knew her. They knew she would never have willingly left without a word, without her passport, without her belongings. As the days bled into weeks, the family's frantic search continued. They followed every tip, chased every rumor, and held onto a dwindling sliver of hope. But as March turned into April, there was still no credible information, no sign of life, no trace of the missing woman. It was as if she had been swallowed whole by the very land she had come to for healing. For more than a month, the search for the missing Latvian woman was a story of agonizing frustration. The family's desperate campaign had forced the case into the public eye, but on the ground, the investigation had hit a wall. There were no credible sightings, no ransom demands, and no forensic leads. The victim's sister and her life partner continued their daily, heartbreaking ritual of distributing flyers and speaking to anyone who would listen, clinging to the hope that she was alive and being held somewhere against her will. The police, for their part, seemed content to let the case grow cold, having exhausted their initial, half-hearted effort. But on the morning of April 20th, 2018, 37 days after the victim vanished, the case would take a horrific and decisive turn. The discovery was not made by police, but by two local fishermen. They were in a small boat, navigating a remote and dense mangrove forest near Thiruvallam, an area not far from Kovalam Beach but worlds away in its isolation. The forest was known locally as a secluded spot, a place frequented by drug dealers and petty criminals, difficult to access and shielded from prying eyes. As the fishermen made their way through the tangled waterways, they were struck by a pungent, deeply unpleasant odor. Driven by a grim curiosity, they followed the smell to its source. What they found would be seared into their memories forever. In a small clearing, they saw a human body in an advanced state of decomposition. It was in a grotesque position, hanging upside down by one leg from the low-hanging branch of a tree. Due to the effects of nature and decomposition over many weeks, the head had separated from the body and was lying on the ground nearby. The fishermen immediately abandoned their boat and rushed to the nearest village to report the terrible find. When police arrived at the scene, the area was cordoned off. The state of the remains was so severe that immediate visual identification was impossible. However, the tattered remnants of clothing, the yoga leggings and t-shirt, and the long hair matched the description of the missing woman. Near the body, investigators collected a few telling items: packets of cigarettes, a bottle of packaged drinking water, and a lighter. While the family held their breath, waiting for official confirmation, the body was carefully removed and transported to a medical college hospital for a full autopsy. The sister was asked to identify the clothing, and with a heavy heart, she confirmed they belonged to her sibling. The final, irrefutable proof would come from a DNA analysis, which soon confirmed the body was indeed that of the missing 33-year-old victim. The desperate search was over. The fight for justice was about to begin. While the discovery was horrific, it was the forensic report from the autopsy that would provide the first measure of objective truth in a case clouded by speculation and police inaction. The report, prepared by a forensic expert named Dr. K. Sasakala, systematically dismantled the lingering theories of suicide that some officials had quietly promoted to protect the region's tourism image. The findings pointed unequivocally to a violent, brutal murder. There was evidence of blunt force trauma to the neck. More damning was the discovery of a fractured thyroid cartilage, a clear and powerful indicator of strangulation. The expert also found blood clots in the brain and bruising on the neck, further cementing the conclusion that she had been killed by force. In total, the report noted 9 separate injuries on her body. A toxicology screening was also conducted, and it found no traces of drugs in her system. The scientific evidence was now on the record. The victim had not taken her own life, nor had she died of an overdose. She had been murdered. The autopsy results transformed the case overnight. No longer a missing person file to be quietly shelved, it was now an active homicide investigation under intense international scrutiny. The pressure on the Kerala police, with the location of the body being a known criminal hangout, investigators finally began to focus their efforts where the family had urged them to from the beginning: on the network of unlicensed tourist guides, drug dealers, and sexual predators who operated around Kovalam Beach. They started re-interviewing locals, and this time, with a body discovered, people who had previously been silent began to talk. Key witnesses came forward to say they had, in fact, seen the foreign woman on the day she disappeared. They reported seeing her walking towards the mangrove forest in the company of 2 local men. The investigation quickly centered on 2 prime suspects, a 28-year-old named Umesh and a 32-year-old named Udan. These were not simply men of interest. They were hardened, professional criminals with a history of preying on the vulnerable. Their criminal records painted a terrifying picture of the danger they posed. Umesh had a history of drug and sexual assault charges. Udan's record was even more alarming. At the time of the investigation, he was already implicated in 13 separate criminal cases, including 6 for sexual assault and 1 for attempted murder. They operated under the guise of being friendly, unofficial tourist guides, a common tactic used to approach and lure unsuspecting visitors. They knew the isolated mangrove forest was their territory, a place where they could act with impunity. On May 3, 2018, both men were taken into custody. During intense interrogation, their stories crumbled, and they confessed to the crime. Their account was chilling in its predatory simplicity. They told investigators they had spotted the victim at Kovalam Beach, alone and appearing distressed. Seeing a vulnerable target, they approached her, pretending to be tour guides. They promised to show her a special, beautiful place and offered to smoke marijuana with her. They lured her into taking a boat with them to the secluded mangrove forest. Once there, in that isolated spot, they subjected her to a brutal sexual assault. According to their confession, the victim fought back fiercely. During the struggle, to silence and subdue her, they strangled her to death. To cover up their crime and make it appear like a suicide, they then hoisted her body into the tree. The confession, combined with the powerful forensic evidence and their own violent histories, provided the prosecution with a clear and undeniable narrative of the murder. The mystery of what had happened to the missing woman had been solved in the most horrific way imaginable. The confession from the two suspects provided a sickeningly clear picture of the victim's final hours. However, the path to legal justice would prove to be a long and arduous ordeal for her family, a marathon of endurance that would test their resolve for more than 4 years. The case was brought before the court in Tiruvananthapuram, but the proceedings were plagued by numerous and lengthy delays, each postponement adding another layer of grief and frustration for the victim's sister and life partner, who remained in India to see the process through. During the trial, both of the accused men retracted their initial confessions. Their defense attorneys argued that their clients had been tortured by the police into admitting to the crime, a claim that is not uncommon in the Indian justice system. They pleaded not guilty to all charges, forcing the prosecution to build its case from the ground up. Despite this challenge, the evidence against them was overwhelming. The prosecution methodically laid out its case, piece by piece. They presented the definitive forensic report that proved the victim had been strangled. They brought forward the witnesses who had seen her being led into the mangrove forest by the two men. They detailed the suspects' extensive and violent criminal histories, painting a clear picture of them as habitual predators who had been allowed to operate freely in a major tourist area. The defense's attempts to discredit the evidence and portray the suspects as scapegoats ultimately failed to convince the court. On December 6, 2022, nearly 5 years after the victim was murdered, the final verdict was delivered. The court found both Umesh and Udayan guilty of first-degree murder, rape, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. They were sentenced to the maximum possible penalty short of death, life imprisonment till death, with no possibility of parole. They were also ordered to pay a fine to the victim's family. For the sister and life partner, the verdict was not a moment of celebration, but one of profound and heavy relief. Their grueling, years-long battle in a foreign land was finally over. Justice, though painfully slow, had finally been served. The impact of this horrific crime, however, extended far beyond the courtroom. For the victim's family, the tragedy was a life-altering event. Her sister and life partner had been forced to become reluctant activists, navigating a complex and often indifferent foreign legal system. They had sacrificed years of their lives, spending their savings and relying on donations to stay in India to fight for the truth. Their journey exposed the deep flaws within the local law enforcement and justice systems, and they became outspoken advocates for the safety of tourists in India, ensuring the world would not forget what happened. The case also delivered a severe blow to the carefully crafted image of Kerala as God's own country. The murder of a foreign tourist who had come seeking healing sent shockwaves through the global travel community. It raised serious questions about the safety of visitors, particularly solo female travelers, in a state heavily reliant on tourism. The initial mishandling of the case by the local police became an international embarrassment, revealing a disturbing willingness to prioritize image over justice, to blame the victim rather than conduct a serious investigation. The story laid bare a darker side to the idyllic destination, forcing a difficult conversation about the systemic issues that allowed such a crime to occur. Ultimately, the murder of Liga Scromain stands as a powerful and tragic case study. It is a story about the failure of a system to protect the vulnerable, both before and after the crime. The two men responsible were not first-time offenders. They were known predators with violent histories who should have been monitored far more closely, if not already incarcerated. The initial police response was a catastrophic failure of duty, one that could have left a brutal murder unsolved were it not for the extraordinary persistence of the victim's family. Their refusal to accept the official narrative, their masterful use of the media, and their unwavering determination transformed a personal tragedy into an international cause. They forced a system to be accountable when it desperately wanted to look the other way. The case is a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lie beneath a beautiful surface, but it is also an enduring testament to the incredible power of love and the lengths a family will go to find truth and honor the memory of one of their own. Case 6. November 24, 1994, was the victim's 21st birthday. On stage, under the lights of a concert hall at Tsinghua University, she was the picture of grace and talent. Her fingers moved expertly across the strings of the ancient gyukin, a traditional Chinese instrument she played with professional skill. She was a gifted musician, a key member of the university's orchestra, and also proficient in piano. The audience was captivated by her solo performance. This young woman was not just an artist, she was also a brilliant science student, majoring in physical chemistry at one of China's most prestigious institutions. She was described by everyone who knew her as beautiful, intelligent, outgoing, and kind. Her future seemed limitless. This performance would be the last time the public saw her truly healthy, the last image of a life brimming with promise before it was systematically and cruelly destroyed. Just days after her birthday concert, in early December 1994, the first signs appeared. It started with a severe, stabbing pain in her abdomen. Then came waves of nausea. Most alarmingly, her long, dark hair began to fall out in clumps. Within a few days, she was completely bald. Her parents, both senior engineers, were deeply concerned and took her to Tongren Hospital in Beijing on December 23rd. She was admitted, and for nearly a month, doctors ran countless tests, yet they remained completely baffled. They could not identify the cause of her mysterious illness. Strangely, during her hospital stay, her symptoms began to subside on their own. The intense pain lessened, and by the time she was discharged in January 1995, her hair had even started to grow back. It seemed like a bizarre, unexplained medical episode that had passed. Believing she was on the road to recovery, she returned to Tsinghua University to begin the new semester in February. The respite was tragically brief. On March 6, 1995, the nightmare returned with terrifying force. The symptoms were the same, but their intensity was magnified tenfold. This time, the attack was not just on her digestive system, but on her nerves. She began to experience excruciating pain in her legs, a torment so severe she could barely stand. This was quickly followed by dizziness and a creeping paralysis that started in her feet and moved upward. Her parents, now frantic, rushed her to a different, more renowned hospital, the Peking Union Medical College Hospital, or PUMSH. She was admitted to the neurology department on March 9th. Her condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. The doctors at PUMSH were as puzzled as their colleagues at the previous hospital. They suspected she might have Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare disorder where the body's immune system attacks the nerves. But the treatments for this condition had no effect. The mysterious illness continued its relentless assault. By March 22nd, her respiratory system was failing. She fell into a deep coma, unable to breathe on her own, and was placed on a ventilator. On March 28th, she was moved to the intensive care unit. The brilliant, vibrant musician and scientist now lay motionless, her life sustained only by machines, while the medical experts surrounding her had no answers. As the victim lay in a coma, her friends from high school and university watched with a growing sense of helplessness. One of them, a student named Bi Jisheng, refused to stand by and do nothing. In 1995, the internet in China was in its infancy. Access was extremely limited, mostly confined to universities and research institutions. It was a text-based world of newsgroups and email forums, a far cry from the web we know today. But this friend saw it as a last resort. He and a group of classmates embarked on an unprecedented mission. They painstakingly translated the victim's entire medical file into English, documenting every symptom, every failed test, and every dead-end diagnosis. On April 10, 1995, they posted a message titled "SOS" to several Usenet newsgroups, online discussion forums that functioned as a global bulletin board. To protect her privacy, they slightly altered her details, describing her as a medical student. The post was a desperate plea for help, a detailed cry for assistance sent out into the digital void, hoping that somewhere in the world, an expert might recognize the pattern of her symptoms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of emails poured in from doctors, toxicologists, and medical professionals across the globe. They came from the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, and beyond. As the victim's friends sorted through the flood of responses, a clear and chilling consensus began to emerge. Approximately one-third of the emails, nearly 1,800 of them, all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. The symptoms were a textbook case of poisoning by a heavy metal called thallium. Thallium salts are colorless, odorless, and tasteless, making them a perfect, insidious poison. The key indicators were all there. The initial gastrointestinal distress, the rapid and total hair loss, and the subsequent severe neurological damage. The temporary recovery followed by a more severe relapse was also a classic sign of two separate exposures: a first dose, followed by a second, much larger one. Armed with this wealth of expert opinion from around the world, the victim's friend compiled the emails and rushed them to the doctors at PUMSH on April 18. He presented the overwhelming evidence that she was suffering from thallium poisoning. Inexplicably, the doctors dismissed them. They stated that the hospital was not equipped to test for thallium exposure and that they had no experience with such a case in their clinical history. They clung to their initial, incorrect diagnosis of Guillain-Barré syndrome. For 10 agonizing days, as the poison continued to ravage the victim's body, no action was taken. The victim's family and friends were devastated but refused to give up. They pleaded, argued, and applied immense pressure on the hospital to conduct the necessary tests. Finally, the hospital relented, but the family had to take matters into their own hands. They managed to acquire samples of the victim's hair, blood, and urine. They then had to find a facility capable of performing the analysis, not a hospital, but a specialized occupational safety and health laboratory in Beijing run by a man named Chen Zhenyang. He had the equipment to test for exposure to heavy metals. On April 28, 1995, the results came back. The numbers confirmed the internet's diagnosis in the most horrific way imaginable. The concentration of thallium in the victim's body was thousands of times higher than the lethal level. The analysis of her hair provided a grim timeline. The poison was present in distinct segments of her hair shafts, confirming that she had been poisoned on at least 2 separate occasions, with a much larger dose administered during the second attack in March. The mystery of her illness was solved. This was not a disease, it was an attempted murder. That same evening, the doctors at Pumsch finally began administering the antidote, a chemical compound called Prussian blue. It works by binding to thallium in the digestive system, preventing it from being absorbed into the body and allowing it to be flushed out. While the treatment did begin to remove the poison, for the victim, it was tragically late. The thallium had already been in her system for months, causing catastrophic and irreversible damage to her central and peripheral nervous systems. A week later, on May 5, 1995, the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau officially opened a criminal investigation. The case was now in the hands of the police. Their first task was to determine how the victim could have been poisoned with such a rare and tightly controlled substance. Thallium and its compounds were not available to the public. They were used in specific scientific research and were supposed to be kept under strict lock and key. The investigation immediately focused on the one place where the victim spent almost all of her time, and the only logical source of the poison, Tsinghua University's chemistry department. Investigators quickly confirmed that the university's labs did possess thallium salt. Access was restricted to a handful of professors and students working on specific research projects that required it. The poisoner had to be someone with authorized access, or someone who could gain access through a person with authorization. This significantly narrowed the pool of potential suspects. The method of poisoning administered over a long period, in 2 separate doses, strongly suggested that the perpetrator was someone in the victim's immediate circle, someone who shared meals with her, who was in her living space, and who she trusted completely. The focus naturally fell upon her classmates and, more specifically, her roommates in the dormitory. But as the police arrived at the university to begin their formal investigation, they were met with a stunning and insurmountable obstacle. The primary crime scene had been completely compromised. Sometime between April 28, when the thallium diagnosis was confirmed, and May 7, when police intended to search her dormitory, a theft occurred. All of the victim's personal belongings from her room had vanished. Her water bottle, her cup, her chopsticks and bowl, her cosmetics, her shampoo, her toothbrush, every single item that could have been used to administer the poison and could have held forensic traces of thallium was gone. The university's official explanation was that the dormitory had been cleaned and her possessions had been lost. This single act of evidence destruction, whether intentional or born of incredible negligence, dealt a fatal blow to the investigation before it had even truly begun. Without the contaminated items, there was no direct physical evidence to link a suspect to the act of poisoning, leaving investigators with only circumstantial clues and a very small circle of potential culprits. The official police investigation began in May of 1995, but it was already compromised. With the primary evidence from the victim's dormitory room gone, investigators were left with a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. However, that circumstantial evidence was incredibly strong and pointed in one specific direction. The poison thallium was only accessible in the chemistry labs. The method suggested an attacker with close, daily proximity. When investigators cross-referenced the list of people with legitimate access to thallium with the victim's circle of close contacts, one name stood out: Sun Y. The suspect was the victim's classmate and one of her dormitory roommates. More importantly, it was confirmed that she was the only student among the victim's friends and roommates who was part of a research team that gave her legitimate, authorized access to thallium salts for her thesis project. She had the means, the access, and the opportunity. The question for investigators was the motive. Why would a promising young student commit such a horrific act against her own roommate? As police and the public looked closer, a narrative of jealousy and rivalry began to form. Both young women were members of the prestigious university orchestra. The victim, however, was considered the more talented musician, particularly on the guitar. She was a featured performer, earning praise and a prominent position on stage that the suspect allegedly envied. Friends and classmates later recounted stories of friction and competition between the two, suggesting a deep-seated resentment on the part of the suspect over the victim's talents and popularity. While it seemed like a petty reason for such a brutal crime, it was the only plausible motive that investigators could find. With a prime suspect identified who had means, motive, and opportunity, one would expect a swift and thorough investigation. But what followed was a period of baffling inaction. For nearly 2 years, the case went cold. The suspect was not formally interrogated. No arrests were made. The victim's family pleaded for progress, but they were met with silence. This inexplicable delay became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, and it led the public to a deeply unsettling conclusion, that the investigation was being deliberately stalled due to the suspect's powerful family background. The suspect's family was not ordinary. Her grandfather was a high-ranking politician who had served as a vice chairman of a major national political committee. Her uncle had also held senior posts, including vice mayor of Beijing. In the China of the 1990s, such connections, known as Guangxi, carried immense weight. The widespread belief was that the family had used its influence to interfere with the investigation, shielding their daughter from justice. Whether it was through direct pressure on the police or a general reluctance by investigators to pursue a suspect with such a powerful family, the result was the same. The case languished, and crucial time was lost. Finally, after nearly 2 years of public silence, there was a development. On April 2, 1997, the Beijing police summoned the suspect for a formal interrogation. She was questioned for 8 hours. But at the end of the session, she was not charged. Her family was allowed to sign for her release, and she walked out of the police station. This would be the first and only time she was ever officially questioned by law enforcement in connection with the poisoning. A little over a year later, in August of 1998, the victim's family received the devastating news they had long feared. A police official informed them that the case was being suspended. The official reason cited was a lack of the key evidence needed to press charges. This was a direct reference to the disappearance of the victim's personal items from the dormitory 3 years earlier. Without that physical proof, prosecutors felt they could not build a case that would stand up in court. The investigation was not officially closed, which would imply the suspect was clear. Instead, it was shelved indefinitely, left in a state of legal limbo. For the family and a growing number of observers, this was not a matter of insufficient evidence, but a failure of the justice system in the face of political influence. Following the suspension of the case, the suspect was free to move on with her life. She successfully graduated from Tsinghua University. She later changed her legal name from Sun Wai to Sun Shuren. She married and, at some point in the early 2000s, emigrated to the United States, where she was reported to have lived and worked in several cities. The contrast could not have been more stark or more painful. While the sole suspect in the case was building a new life under a new identity overseas, the victim remained trapped in a broken body in Beijing. The thallium poisoning had caused permanent, catastrophic damage. Her central nervous system was shattered. She was left almost completely blind. Her limbs were partially paralyzed, and her motor skills were severely impaired. The most profound damage was to her brain. The brilliant student who had excelled in chemistry and dazzled audiences with her music now had the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child. Her life became an endless cycle of medical treatments, complications, and chronic pain. She was entirely dependent on the care of her parents, who were now entering old age. The lives of her parents were also destroyed that day. They had already suffered an unimaginable tragedy years earlier, in 1989, when their older daughter, Wu Jin, died in a tragic accident during a university field trip. Now, they had to watch their only remaining child live a life that was a shadow of her former self. They dedicated the rest of their lives to caring for her. They learned to be nurses, therapists, and her constant companion. Their savings were exhausted by the astronomical medical bills, and they came to rely on financial assistance and donations from the public. And all the while, they continued their fight for justice, writing letters and filing petitions to any official who would listen, a fight that was met with decades of silence. Just as the internet had been instrumental in diagnosing the victim's condition, it would also be the force that refused to let her case be forgotten. In the mid-2000s, as internet usage exploded in China, the story of the Tsinghua poisoning found a new and massive audience on popular online forums like Tianhe Club. A new generation learned the details of the case, the medical mystery, the prime suspect, her powerful family, and the stalled investigation. The story provoked a tidal wave of public outrage. This online pressure appeared to compel the suspect to break her years of silence. In 2005, using a newly created account on the Tianhe forum, she posted a long, detailed statement proclaiming her innocence. She argued that she was not the only student with access to thallium. She insisted that her relationship with the victim had been good and that she had no motive to harm her. She made a controversial claim that the police had officially cleared her as a suspect back in 1998, something the authorities themselves never publicly confirmed. She framed herself as a victim, suggesting that her family's background had not protected her but had instead made her an easy scapegoat for a police force that was unable to solve the crime. The public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Her statement was analyzed word by an army of online sleuths. They found her tone to be defensive and self-serving, lacking any genuine expression of sympathy for the victim's suffering. Her claims were challenged, and perceived inconsistencies were highlighted. Instead of quelling the suspicion, her public defense only fanned the flames, further cementing in the public's mind that she was responsible. A bizarre side note from this period was the emergence of a letter from a self-proclaimed hacker who supported the suspect's innocence and attempted to implicate others. The letter's authenticity was never verified and was widely seen as a clumsy attempt to muddy the waters and divert attention. The court of public opinion had reached its verdict, even if a court of law never would. For years, the case of the Tsinghua poisoning victim remained a painful, open wound, kept alive mostly in the memory of her family and in the corners of the internet where her story was told. And then, in April of 2013, an unrelated tragedy brought her case roaring back into the national spotlight. At Fudan University in Shanghai, a graduate student died after being poisoned by a roommate with a toxic chemical from their medical lab. The parallels were undeniable and immediate. Suddenly, the story of the Tsinghua victim was no longer a cold case from the past. It was a contemporary horror. It had unleashed a decade of pent public fury. The Chinese social media landscape, particularly the microblogging site Weibo, erupted. The hashtag #HelpJuLing began trending, and millions of users shared her story, demanding that authorities finally provide answers and reopen the investigation. The public outrage was more intense and widespread than ever before. This new generation, armed with social media, would not let the issue be ignored. The pressure mounted on the Beijing police to break their 15 years of official silence. And they did. On May 8, 2013, the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau released a formal statement on their official Weibo account. It was the moment the public had been waiting for, but the message it contained extinguished any hope for justice. The statement acknowledged the immense public interest in the case and confirmed that after the poisoning was reported in 1995, a dedicated task force was formed to investigate. They admitted that they had, in fact, focused their investigation on a single suspect. Though they did not use her name, it was clear to everyone they were referring to the victim's roommate. However, the statement went on to declare that the investigation was permanently stalled. They cited two primary reasons. First, there had been a delay in reporting the crime, a subtle shifting of blame onto the timeline of the medical diagnosis, which occurred months after the poisoning began. Second, and more critically, they confirmed the lack of key evidence necessary to meet the standards for a criminal prosecution. This was the official admission that the disappearance of the victim's personal items from her dorm room had fatally crippled the case. The statement concluded by expressing regret that the case could not be solved and thanked the public for their concern. With that, the door was officially and permanently slammed shut. There would be no opening the investigation. The case, in the eyes of the law, was over. The police statement was met with widespread cynicism and anger. To many, it was not an explanation but an excuse, a bureaucratic confirmation of a cover-up. But the fight for accountability took a new, international turn. With the suspect known to be living in the United States, activists created a petition on the We the People section of the White House's official website. The petition called on the U.S. government to investigate the suspect's background and deport her from the country. The response was explosive. In just a few days, the petition gathered over 150,000 signatures, far surpassing the threshold needed to elicit an official response from the administration. While the White House ultimately declined to comment on a specific law enforcement matter, as is standard policy, the petition was a remarkable demonstration of the case's global reach. The story of a poisoned student in Beijing was now a matter of international public record. For the victim, Lev went on in a state of suspended animation. For the next decade, her world was the small apartment she shared with her elderly parents. Their devotion was absolute. Now in their 70s and 80s, they continued to provide the round-the-clock care their daughter needed. They moved her, fed her, and communicated with her in the simple ways that she could still understand. Their struggle was eased somewhat by the kindness of strangers. Public donation funds were established, and people from across China and the world contributed money to help cover the astronomical medical expenses, a testament that while the justice system had failed her, the public had not forgotten. On November 24, 2023, the victim celebrated her 50th birthday. Less than a month later, on December 22, 2023, after nearly 30 years of suffering, her ordeal finally came to an end. She passed away, the result of a brain tumor, a condition likely exacerbated by the long-term effects of the poisoning and her compromised health. Her death marked the end of a life defined by pain, but it reignited the unresolved anger surrounding her case. It was a final, tragic reminder of the justice that was never served. Today, the case remains officially unsolved, but it leaves behind a legacy of deeply troubling and unanswered questions. The first, and most obvious, is the true motive. The prevailing theory of jealousy over a position in the university orchestra feels disturbingly inadequate to explain the sheer cruelty and calculation of the crime. To poison someone not once, but twice, with massive doses of a horrific substance, suggests a depth of hatred that goes beyond simple rivalry. Was there a darker, more personal conflict that has never been revealed? The second question concerns the possibility of accomplice. Who was the person who cleaned the dormitory and removed all of the victim's belongings? Was it a panicked and foolish attempt by university administrators to manage a crisis, or was it a deliberate act of evidence tampering, orchestrated to protect the poisoner? Did the perpetrator act alone in planning and executing such a careful crime? But the largest and most persistent question is about the extent of the political interference that is widely believed to have derailed the investigation. Why did it take the police nearly 2 years, from May 1995 to April 1997, to formally interrogate their one and only suspect? This critical delay gave ample time for any remaining evidence to be destroyed and for external influence to take hold. Was there a direct order from a high-ranking official to stand down? Or was it a more subtle, unspoken understanding among investigators that pursuing a suspect from such a powerful family would be detrimental to their careers? We may never know for certain, but that 2-year gap remains the black hole at the center of the case, a void where justice seems to have disappeared. The poisoning at Tsinghua University was more than just a tragic, unsolved crime. It became a landmark case in the history of the Chinese internet, one of the very first instances of online activism shaping a national conversation. It proved that the collective voice of the public could prevent a story from being buried. But it also became a lasting symbol of systemic injustice, a glaring example of how power and connections could place an individual above the law. Eroded public faith in a justice system that appeared to fail when it was needed most. The enduring image of the case is one of painful contrast. The picture of the victim, bedridden for 3 decades, her life stolen from her, cared for by her heartbroken parents until their final days, set against the specter of the suspect, who changed her name and was free to build a new life in another country. It is this profound injustice, the chasm between the fates of the victim and her suspected attacker, that has burned this story into China's collective memory, ensuring that even though the case is closed, it will never truly be over.